Yeah, we're off. Hi, guys.
The Good Guys Big Deal Days are on now. Get this Westinghouse oven only $729. This Technica oven only $8.99.
So if you would, please subscribe because we want to be able to do that. Mind-blowing. We've been so excited about it. Oh, but before we get to our guests, wanted to give a quick shout-out to the unofficial sponsor of the Goslings.
Oh, yes.
Joel down at Jericho Pottery, JerichoPottery.com.
Yes.
Get the Kothon Spartan mug, inspired and directed by
Hey, Diane, good to see
Pressfield
ya.
in joint venture with Joel over there. So this is the real deal.
Beautiful mugs, and they are not cheap, but you get what you pay for. They are awesome. We absolutely love these things, and they're always in like such limited quantity.
Look at that. Drink like a man. Buy a Kothon.
Yeah. You want to get in touch with your inner Leonidas and
Hi, Hank, good to see ya.
light,
Yes.
then there you go. That's one of the best ways to do it. I do feel more like a Spartan every morning when I'm sitting out there in my underwear on the on the patio watching the dog pee.
I have never in my life felt like a Spartan ever until I got this mug, and I'm like, okay, that's at least a step in the right direction.
Gilding the lily with the Goslings.
All right. Well, do you want to introduce our guests?
Yeah, absolutely. This was a sort of.
Yeah, Diane, I've got a doctor's appointment tomorrow afternoon, so I'm having tomorrow off instead. That's why I streamed today.
A shot in the dark. We sort of aim for the moon here, and in order to honor today is September 11th, and to discuss the esoteric Christian meanings and biblical revelatory meanings that might have been behind such events, we wanted to bring on our two heaviest hitters, our two just brightest minds on these subjects.
Our go-tos, respected minds, this sort of thing.
Champions in these circles. We wanted to bring on Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and Derek Gilbert, author of such books as The Day the Earth Stands Still, the show View from the Bunker, which you can find on YouTube.
Second Coming of Saturn.
The Second Coming of Saturn. Yeah, these guys are both amazing, and they both agreed to join us today. So without further ado, let's bring on,
ladies and gentlemen,
Gary Wayne.
There they are.
And Derek Gilbert.
There they are. How are you gentlemen doing?
Honored to be here. Welcome.
Awesome.
Welcome, Gary. It's good to see you again.
Yes, good to see you again, Derek. Good to be back with the Goslings here, and they always ask challenging questions. So hopefully my mind is up for the challenge today, but we'll see.
Gary, you are a mentat from Duke when it comes to Christian esoterica. So I think at the end of every interview with Gary, my brain is always like just completely more. It's like an engine that's been revved into red the whole time.
More of a Thufir Hawat than a Peter DeVries.
He is, yes, awesome. See, this is like one of the reasons why Derek is so cool. He gets all my dork references. He gets all my cool like nerd sci-fi references.
Great.
You know, and like Derek, your work is amazing, and like no one has like more of a like yeoman-like workhorse attitude towards the YouTube presence than Derek. Like Derek is just always releasing something, whether it's like a View from the Bunker, like, you know, on any of his YouTube channels or his books, his novels with his wife Sharon. Like both of you guys are just like nonstop. It is really inspiring.
Yeah, the funny thing is we feel like slugs because there's so many other things we want to get done, and we just it's like we don't have a new book out yet. What the
You just need to, you know, you need to write like that 800-page tome like Gary, you know. I'm telling you, man.
No, we break it up into 3 books. That way we,
yeah, you can monetize it.
That's the secret
here.
Well, I did write it so that it could be split up into 3 or 5 books.
Oh, that's right.
Book. And the first publisher who went bankrupt, and I had to go get another publisher after, about 30 days from publishing. They both sort of said, well, let's do it in 3 or 5 books, because I said, well, it won't be hard. I can just do a quick run through and read, because I've done it that way. But the editors in both companies came back and said, no, tell it in one story. So, and I promised the second book is going to be smaller than that.
I was going to ask.
But not a whole lot, but it will be smaller. So,
I kind of like the 800-page tome. It's just this imposing, intimidating brick that it's like someone.
It's a gift because it makes me feel smart when I'm walking around with it.
You give that to somebody, you're like giving them something.
Like I read this.
600 or 700 pages. So I'm on either the last chapter or the second last chapter. I think it'll be split up into 2. I'm on chapter 80, technically, probably 81 by the looks of what, I was working on it today. So
yeah, we are so excited for that. I cannot wait for that to come out.
It's going to be fantastic.
And it's loaded with as much detail and information, and with the larger focus on the footnotes and the references, so that there's even more transparency, that there's information in the references, that instead of having to go buy the book or look it up, that they'll have a lot more of it there. Particularly as it comes to with the different languages like the Greek and the Hebrew, I give a lot of information on the original Hebrew words and a lot of the applications that gives the fuller meaning, because the English doesn't really always capture the full context of the words. So,
that's a problem you both run into in a lot of your research, correct?
I don't know if it's a problem so much as it's an opportunity, because we're able to. I hate to take credit for it because I don't read or speak Hebrew, so I have to use dictionaries and depend on friends who do speak or read Hebrew to run things by them. But I think it's almost an indictment against Christian researchers here of the last century or so. One thing Ryan Peterson has really done well in his books is shown that up until about 100 years ago, the idea that the Nephilim were real historical characters was kind of the standard belief in the church. I'd always thought that ever since Augustine, and in fact, I even said that the other day in an interview, and I need to correct that, that Augustine really popularized the idea of the Sethite view of history, that Genesis 6 doesn't really say what it said. Right. And of course, believing that means you have to disregard what Hebrews read into their own language. The words B'nai Ha-Elohim, which always in Hebrew means spirit beings, it doesn't really mean spirit beings. The Hebrew, well, they've invented that language, but they don't really know what it means. Well, it's only been the last 100 years or so that we've moved away from that view, and Ryan has shown that in his books. Like the great theologians of the 19th century and earlier all understood that. And they had to actually look stuff up, or they had to learn the languages themselves. We don't have an excuse. I can go in Logos Bible software on my tablet right here in front of me, hold my finger on a word, and it brings up the Greek or the Hebrew, and then I can tap another thing, and it brings up all of the instances of that in the Bible. So this kind of research is really easy for us today. So it is. That you're leaving it to an old top 40 radio disc jockey to do this work, church. we
really And I really like to encourage people to use those types of tools.
Amen.
I usually, because I just think, the Bible would be a whole lot larger if they provided the full context of a lot of the words. So I understand the issues with the translations into English, but the thing that I would advise people on to be careful with as they're looking at Hebrew or Greek, they all have multiple meanings. A lot of them are nuances that are similar, but some of them have a completely different meaning. And what happens, particularly when people are trying to force feed some meanings and using an interpretive approach, they'll pick a meaning that doesn't fit the sentence that it's in, or the verse that it's in, or the narrative that it's in, or double check throughout the Bible. Does that translation that I would like to use conflict with anything else in the Bible? And if you don't go through those sort of checks, you're going to make mistakes, or you're deliberately trying to mislead. And hopefully people are doing that. But particularly when people are using the interpretive approach, they're manipulating the meaning of the word, and they don't care about all the other things that I listed.
Yeah. What are some of the tools? what are some of the resources, like if you give one or two for people who want to do any of their own studying in any of their own research that you would recommend for sort of getting over this linguistic hurdle and getting deeper into the biblical text? We'll go with Gary first and then Derek, if that's all right.
Yeah, there's a number of good ones. Go get a digital Bible. That would be my first recommendation. And whether it's interlinear or one that connects to Strong's or whatever translation, my preference is to get an old version of the Strong's Concordance, so you get the full definition of the word, and do it through the King James Version Bible, because you have a better link into ancient history with that type of language that some of the newer translations don't have. When I'm just reading a Bible, I like read a modern translation, but to go deep into the research, I will use King James and then go back deeper, but also compare all the different translations, because a lot of times it just hits on something in another translation that leads you in a direction that you just knew was probably there, but you couldn't figure out how to get there, and then it'll show you the way.
Isn't that funny? Because when I was in ordination class, I was only in for a couple of years through my church. And this was in the late 2000s, they really poo-pooed the King James Version and said that, oh, it's the one that had the least amount of resources and it was the most political. But then when you get into more of these like really dedicated Christian theologians, and especially like the autodidactic, theologians and people such as yourselves who there is no real institution to help you guide your way through this. You kind of have to rely on the Holy Spirit and your own, moral compass to sort of figure this out in your own intellect. A lot of you guys tend to sort of fall back on the King James Version.
King James is a good translation, but there have been things that have been discovered over the last 400 years. So Sharon and I will look at the King James. When we do our weekly Bible study, we use the ESV, the English Standard Version, which is like the King James in that it's a word-for-word translation, but it's in more modern English. But we also look at the Septuagint for the Old Testament, because a friend of ours, Doug Woodward, has published a 2-volume set called Rebooting the Bible, and where he shows how the Masoretes, who were the Hebrew scholars who translated the version of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, that most of our English Bibles are based on today, which that was completed around 900 or 1000 AD. They changed a few things from the older Hebrew text, and we can discern this from the Septuagint translation that was translated from Hebrew into Greek by about 200 BC. And there are places where a couple of subtle differences emerge. One is in a de-emphasis of the existence of other entities in the spirit realm, because after the 2nd century AD, when Christians said, we know who the second power in heaven was. We know who the angel of Yahweh was in the Old Testament. That was Jesus of Nazareth. And obviously Jews would have a problem. Jewish religious scholars would have a problem with that.
Right.
There's not enough changed in the Old Testament so that our Old Testaments are unreliable for the prophecies of the coming Messiah or for the for Christian doctrine. But for example, the ages of the patriarchs were changed by the Masoretes to move the expected time of the Messiah's arrival away from the 1st century AD. So they actually lengthened the lifespans of a number of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, because there was an expectation that after that in this 7th millennium from creation, the Messiah would arrive. And so anyway, there's some interesting differences here and there. And so it's a window into what Jewish religious scholars understood about their texts 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus. So we look at the Masoretic text. BibleHub.com is a great place to get translations. Blue Letter Bible is a great reference because it's got the interlinear, and it also has the Strong's, and also Gesenius, Wilhelm Gesenius, Hebrew Chaldee lexicon, which is another useful tool. And these are available online for free. So again, we Christians don't have an excuse to not take advantage of these. We've got internet, which all of us do with our phones. You probably have an app that can access most of these things and take advantage of it. But I'll echo what Gary said. When you're looking at Strong's or Gesenius, you can find a number of different references or different definitions for the same word, and you have to be careful not to pick the one that you want the word to mean. Look for the other uses of that word in the Old Testament to see how the context, whether it fits the context, and that's really important.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I remember Nick had said something about like the past 100 years or so, and you know how a lot of this stuff, you know, you guys have talked about it in regards to like the Nephilim. You know, the Sethite theory has been sort of just swept under the rug, or the Sethite theory has been promoted. The true theory has been swept under the rug. I remember, I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on this. Our dad, when I first started writing the Heavenly Realms books in like '99, I was like 17, and he gave me this little book that was written in 1920 called The Spirit World by Clarence Larkin. Yeah. And this little book with all of his little, you know, hand-drawn paintings and diagrams and everything, it talked about all of this stuff. This was not, you know, this is not something that's like new and crazy. It's not something that some like weird Christian, you know, cultist dreamed up in an ayahuasca, you know, haze, you know, in the 60s or something. Like, this is stuff that like has been around, and for some reason, I don't know when it was sort of eliminated, but it must have been over the past 100 years of seminary school teaching, because this book from the 1920s laid out everything you guys talk about, from the Nephilim to the Watchers to Lucifer and the nature of Lucifer versus Satan and the disembodied spirits, you know, and how demons and fallen angels are not the same things. And I tried presenting this stuff to people, you know, my teachers in my Christian school. Every one of them shot him down in favor of the Sethite theory. It was so bizarre.
I think it's because, I suspect it's because Clarence Larkin was part of the dispensationalist movement. And that was something that was starting to gain some ground in about 100 years ago.
Century.
But I don't know, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like the Sethite view was like the prominent, accepted interpretation of Genesis 6 for like 1,000 years, over 1,000 years. That was like the main interpretation.
Actually, no, that's not really the case. You know, just as, you know, Jerome wrote about it, and he was hoping that those beings, the Nephilim, didn't exist, but he never really, you know, was come out and said that they didn't. It was just like, it was a horrible thought for him that they could possibly exist. So it was common teaching throughout the church up till, Derek said, about 100 years ago, might be a little bit longer, but not that long ago. And I think what happens is there is what I would call a infiltration of the seminary schools, both Catholic and Protestant. And the ministers just were not taught to teach prehistory and prophecy. And they're just told not to go there because you can make, you know, I think part of the rationale is that you can make a lot of mistakes doing it. Or you could get, you know, out into a sort of maybe a fringe area there, and you'd be, so I think that's the rationale. I think the reason is to make sure that as a whole, as many as possible, are prepared for what is coming. So even though you have a lot of church teachers that have been talking about the end time coming, you know, particularly in the last 100 or 150 years, and, you know, kind of been wrong on their dates and stuff, which is a problem. It's a different problem. You also have the polytheists that have been trying to bring this about and are impatient because they can't bring it about as fast as they want. So they've been trying to prepare people for deceptions and the delusions for a long period of time. And that's where you hit right at the core is where Christians are taught. They're only taught, well, I mean, they're taught good things in churches, but they're not taught. Is
that me crackling or them?
Yeah, we experienced this with some of our family members, how when you try and bring this up, the response is, you know, oh, I've never heard that. Yeah, that was never
too outlandish, too fantastic.
That's too Lord of the Rings. You know, what is this, Narnia? You know, you're like, well, there's a reason why that stuff may be popular. You know, Anyway, so okay, cool. Nick, I know you got a bunch of questions that
Come on, Gary, say
we
something.
do. Oh yes, we do.
come up with. We could do this forever. It depends on how much time you guys have today, because we'll take up all of it if you let us.
So, I mean, obviously today is a very solemn day for a lot of Americans, 9/11. And I wanted to start with Gary and ask, in your view, Gary, how do you see 9/11 play into biblical prophecy?
Well, I think it's a step along the way. I'm not convinced it's one of the key TSN turning points. That's a saying in Canada on the sports channel for something that happens in a game. But it was important. It was opportunity to move in a global direction with the doors that had opened up, whether it was a contrived, planned event by the West or it was totally independent. I'll leave that for what other people want to research and believe. But I look at the outcomes of it, and the outcomes were trying to get rid of all of the banks of the world to replace them with the reserve banks, which was a significant play that sort of went on with some of the wars that they were knocking off the last of those financial institutions. It was a way to try and prepare the geopolitical scenario for the end time, particularly in the Middle East, so that they could move things in a quicker direction that way. It caused chaos and anarchy, which they need to have. They need to polarize, which they began polarizing in a significant way, and to spread the anarchy because they need to polarize and then drive people, as I call it, cattle herd, into the open arms of the globalists. So they create the problem, then they provide the solution. And it was a ramp up of that, but it's not one of the events that has brought about world government yet. It was one of those things that is one of those steps along the way, and they keep it keeps building in that sort of direction. But what it did do was it put the U.S. from a path of economic firm ground in terms of, if you look at coming off of all of the debts of the 70s, of the 80s, the debts were being paid down. And then it provided this open door that is the precursor to the Great Reset through trying to bankrupt the West and bankrupt the world so that they can, again, bring in their globalist sort of solutions. So there's a lot of things that came out of it, but not that sort of cataclysmic event that just sort of turned everything on its ear. But it did change the world, just as COVID changed the world. And I think that's another step along the way. And whether or not you believe it's contrived, like I do or not, it happened, and it created an opportunity for the globalists that they gladly walked through. And so I think that's the same MO, and it continues even after COVID.
Yeah, it's that Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution, and if nothing else, it sure made you hate going to the airport because that used to be fun and cool.
That changed forever.
Yeah,
remember, it was supposed to be temporary.
Oh yeah, like of course, it's always just a temporary measure until you get used to it. Yeah, it's that death by 1,000 cuts.
Derek, what do you think? How do you think 9/11 ties into biblical prophecy?
Well, I track with Gary. I think it's just another step along the road toward the rebuilding of Babel, which is, I think, has become more evident as we've gotten closer to closer to that end. I mean, the World Economic Forum is making no bones about wanting to have a world where nobody owns anything, well, except for them, of course. This was at point number 3 on their list of 8 predictions. By the year 2030, you will own nothing and you'll be happy.
Yes.
You'll rent everything that you need. Yeah. Somebody's going to be owning the stuff that all of the rest of us have to rent. They never talk about who's owning all of this stuff that we have to rent. You will rent your clothes. Really? But when you go back 5,000 years to the Uruk period of history, where the city of Uruk in ancient Sumer, which dominated the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf all the way up into the Taurus Mountains of Turkey, there was a period about 800 or 900 years there where that city-state dominated the political landscape. So really everything that we know of today as Iraq and southeastern Turkey was under the control of one city. And that just, according to the Bible, that was the center, the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom. And if you follow his career in the book of Genesis, there are just a few clues there. He went forth and he built cities, and the cities that are mentioned are in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. That sort of tracked with the expansion of the city of Uruk, what archaeologists call the Uruk expansion. This is roughly 3900 to about 3100 BC. And around 3100 BC, the whole thing just fell apart. But this period of history is so well documented in the archaeological record. There's a certain type of fossil, not fossil, but archaeological find, an artifact, that's the word I was struggling to find, an artifact that sort of defines the site as an Uruk period site. It's a little clay bowl, colored, you know, it looks like it's crudely made almost by a kid with Play-Doh. And they find hundreds of them, sometimes thousands of them, at a site that was an Uruk period site. And they've determined through clues in Sumerian texts that this bowl was essentially used like the Sumerian equivalent of a modern styrofoam fast food container. You give workers this little bowl every morning as they go out to the fields to work as serfs in the fields, and that was their day's ration. Wow. And because these things were so cheap to make, they would just kind of throw it away at the end of the day. So when archaeologists working in Syria or Iraq find a site, if they start coming across these bowls, okay, Uruk period. Well, that sort of defines Nimrod's kingdom, the kingdom of Uruk, the world's first empire. Yeah. You basically had a group of people who were sent out to work and produce for the upper class, the priest kings, if you will. Mm-hmm. And that you didn't own anything, but every day, as long as you were good little serfs, you get your little bowl of barley, and then you go out in the field and then throw it away, come back home, and you get some more. And this is what, if 5,000 years ago, if you had today's woke PR spinmeisters working in ancient Sumer, you would have called the guaranteed basic income or universal basic.
Yeah, the UBI.
How about that?
Essentially, what that we're trying to get back to that. 9/11 was certainly a push in that direction. COVID is another, and of course, the climate crisis or so-called crisis is another. And 5 years ago, people said that anyone who talked this way was a foil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. But it's right on the World Economic Forum's website right now. You can read this stuff. Hey, stop eating meat. We've got alternative protein for you. Or bugs, but in the real world we call insects. Yeah. Right. Have a bowl of cricket.
Yeah. Cricket and soy, and then Chinese mealworms, and then the stuff they grow in the factories now, or the labs.
So this is what they're pushing us toward. But it's going to take, obviously, the crises that we've seen over the last 20 years weren't quite enough to push us in that direction.
Right. Yeah, despite
to get us to that direction. They pushed us in that direction because clearly there are certain places here in America. I mean, even when I go to St. Louis to visit our daughter for our annual, Cubs Cardinals game, I feel like coming from the Ozarks, like I've stepped into a different reality.
Yeah.
Because here in the Ozarks, we were pretty much done with masks about a year and a half ago. And in St. Louis, you still see a lot of people driving around in their cars with their masks on.
By themselves.
Yeah. And I'm sure on the coast, there's even more of that. So, but God bless them. Jesus died for them too. So
that's right. Yeah, Gary, I think I could tell you were on the perch, ready to fly, with a thought there.
Oh, I get thoughts coming through my head all the time. So
I know. I watch you.
I'm incorrigible that way. So undisciplined, some people call it. But well, I really like some of the things that Derek was touching on, and particularly, as you look at, that age of Uruk, both before and after the flood, and Gilgamesh being from Uruk and being, 11 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide. So as a royal cubit as the king, he'd be over 19 feet tall and 7 feet wide.
feet.
So he would make King Og look small by comparison, because again, as a king, you might say with his bed was being 9 cubits and 4 cubits wide. I mean, that's going to get you from a royal up about 16 feet doing the math, and 7 feet wide, so he'd be smaller than that. And he's the last of the Refaim. So Og is a little different sort of giant than what Gilgamesh is. Gilgamesh is a dark-haired giant with black beard, as he sort of pictured, just as Nimrod is equated in a similar sort of look, and that's more of the Amorites and the Aryans. It was a branch of one of the terrible ones that settled into the Persia area and then into the Indus Valley. And I just thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because that is that class system that they set up. It's a 4-class system that was set up all around the world, where you have the ruling class that included the warrior class, and then you have a separate class that is still bloodline, which is the priest class, right? And then you have like the nobility class that is controlling all of the major industry, which is again part of the bloodlines, right? So you can separate that into 2 or 3. I usually separate it into 2, because it's that larger elite, with the religious class being a separate one. And then you have a small entrepreneurial class, a small business, and then you have the slaves. That's whether or not you go to First Nations in North America, that's still in place today, or you go to India, or you go anywhere around the world, or you go to the feudal system that our civilization comes out of, from Western feudal system. And then you understand that that's what they're trying to bring back by destroying that middle class again, right? To get it right down to a small entrepreneurial class and slaves. That's what it's sort of all about. And then when you're talking about all this processed food of insects and plant foods, that they want to just keep the best of the food and everything for themselves, because they're afraid there's probably not going to be enough.
Yeah, I'm going well, Ryan. Thanks for asking. How about you?
Forms itself into something that we saw in, I think, a Charlton Heston movie in the 1960s. I can't remember the name. Soil and Green. Yeah. Now we're eating ourselves and totally profiling ourselves, because we have no idea what's going to go into the food.
Yeah, and that's it's funny, because on one hand, that what you're describing in Uruk, Derek, is exactly like a to-go containers, especially like the early McDonald's containers that were all styrofoam, and it's the same thing. If you're a day laborer, if you work in an office and you don't have time to make a meal at home because it takes 10 to 30 minutes, so you go through the drive-through and you get your little disposable things you can eat it. Build the bricks for the Nimrodian temple.
More than just convenient.
Right. Yeah. Well, and they're even trying to do away with that. Like Gary, you're talking about the squeezing out of the middle class. That's something that Nick and I talk about all the time, just because of our politics and being conservative. With libertarian leanings, you kind of see that like the middle class is really, maybe with the Constitution, although we just pay lip service to that these days, really what kind of defines America is the middle class. And the middle class getting squeezed out is how you get to that point of that sort of Marxist totalitarian dystopia, where there's the elite 1 to 3%, and then there's the 99 to 97% who are all either having to take mass transportation. That's why they're pushing for electric cars right now, so that you can't use your petrol vehicle anymore, because your car is freedom. There is nothing in America, there's nothing more liberating, even a gun. There's nothing more liberating than a car. You can go anywhere, you can live in it if you have to, you can work and make money, you can handle
buy gas anywhere.
Right. But if you make us go to electric, and then eventually what they want is mass transportation. Everybody takes the subway, or you ride a bicycle like in Europe. And then the only people who have the freedom to do it are the ones who can afford the Teslas.
Yeah, well, the thing about the electric cars is it's not just you charge a car and then you can drive it wherever you want, whenever you want.
Yeah,
it is controlled. It is controlled. It gives them
even the
power over your. Sorry,
guys. Where's the what state was it recently that made the news for having their thermostats controlled via was it Colorado? Yeah. Yeah, like what was it?
Sharon and I had that happen in Indiana back in 2000. 2000. Where were we? We had 3 different addresses when we were there. It was 2011. It was the summer of 2010 actually. We were renting a place, and the owner had signed up for a special deal with the power company there, which I think was Duke Energy. Yeah. And if you allowed them the power to override your thermostat on days of high load, you'd get a break on your monthly bill. Thing is, we were renting and we were paying utilities, but the governor was still on the electric meter. And so it got to like a 97-degree day or something. And it was an older home, built like 1905 or something. And so the second and third floors got really hot in the summer. And at the time, Sharon was still dealing a lot with fibromyalgia. This was before she lost weight. And she was miserable because once she overheated, she had real trouble cooling down again. So she was miserable because we could not cool a house below something like 80 degrees.
Jeez.
So this made the news recently, but this is something that's been building. This is something that's ongoing. The same thing with the insurance companies that promise you a break if you'll let them, here, plug this into your car and let us monitor your driving habits for a little while, and then we'll set a rate based on how you drive. Yes, because they're tracking you wherever you go and make sure that you're not speeding or wherever. You're not where you're not supposed to. Oh, we saw that you pulled into the liquor store there.
My insurance company, I had all the breaks, I had all the discounts, and I went to renew. They called me and said, hey, we want to renew your policy this year. I know we're talking about insurance. I know, folks, this is assumably really boring, but this is the point.
But it's
I promise. They said, hey, you might qualify for this particular discount if you put this tracker in your car. And I said, and what will my discount be? And they looked at it and they said, and this is the lady over the phone. She goes, oh, well, actually, you're already getting that discount. But if you put the tracker in the car, you can keep it. You can keep the discount.
Really?
Yeah.
Pass.
So my insurance went up that year.
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, you didn't want to be minority reported.
But that sort of leads into one of the large misconceptions that I think is out there, that particularly with Christians, is that somehow you're going to be able to be off the grid and they're not going to be able to find you or track you. You can be in some wilderness area and you can be self-sufficient. They control everything and they can find people anywhere now if they really want to, and that technology continues to advance. So you roll that forward to what the mark of the beast and the image can do. That can kill you for not worshiping them. That means it has the ability to track you down. Mm-hmm. And if you're still here. And so it's one of those things where Christians need to maybe start taking another approach as to how do you prepare for what's coming, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk out. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do things to try and make our lives a little bit easier if we can. But we're quickly running out of ramp where we can find any sort of protection. So our protection is going to be our faith, and our duty is to testify and let things fall where they fall and try and educate more people. So you can build bunkers all you want. That's not going to help. And even if you did, people are going to go and find you and steal your food. It's going to get that bad. Now, that's even way before the mark of the beast and Antichrist takes the power.
And I'm that guy. I'm like the, bury the guns and the gold in a bunker and have a fallback location.
Yeah, that is you.
Have a picket, and get a dog and figure out how to garden, water filtration. But one thing, and you do realize when you really sit down and think about it, you're like, okay, this is a zero-sum game equation. Ultimately, this is not an I win sort of thing. Even if you have your boogaloo fantasy or whatever, it's just what keeps you sane is knowing this is a house, but it is not our home. On a spiritual level. That's what keeps you grounded.
Speaking of that, when you look at the dwindling resources and you look at the food supply and the increasing control, and a lot of everyone that I know is like, oh yeah, we are definitely in the end times. I've always wondered this about you guys, and I never want to make any assumptions, but do you guys see yourselves as, do you think that the rapture is yet to come? Do you think are you guys kind of pre-trib, post-trib, premillennial?
Yeah.
What do you kind of, and I'm not trying to put you in a box, but kind of where do you fall eschatologically?
Yeah.
Let's start with Derek.
Pre-trib and premillennial. I mean, one follows the other, of course. If you're premillennial, you pretty much have to be pre-trib, but the other way around. But But I'm open to evidence that a pre-wrath rapture. I'm not really convinced that there's a whole lot of difference between pre-trib and pre-wrath, other than the way you define your terms. But it's essentially comes down to this for me: the prophecy of the 70 weeks delivered to Daniel. If we assume that the 70th week is still to come, and that, as the angel said to Daniel, 70 weeks have been allotted for your people and the holy city, and if we're waiting for that 70th week to arrive, that last 7-year period being what we would call the Great Tribulation, if we assume that your people means the Jews, then the church would not be among the your people. Now, again, that's drawing conclusions based on not, say, rock solid DNA forensic evidence, but that's why I fall there. Now, does it mean we're not going to endure tribulation? Well, Jesus said that his followers would endure tribulation. So regardless of when we go, we're going to be persecuted. I think we American Christians have a very Amerocentric view when we say, well, we have to go through tribulation, and you've got the people, our brothers and sisters in the Middle East and China and parts of Africa holding up their hands and saying, excuse me.
Right, we've been doing it for 200 years now, or thousands of years.
Since Muhammad and his followers came out of Arabia in the 7th century.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But the reason the West is called the West is because that's all was left after the armies of Islam got done with it.
Right. Yeah.
That's not a joke. That's serious. That's why it's called the West. That's all that was left after
all that was
left. You had it in the 8th century. If it wasn't for Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, Britain might have fallen to Islam in the 8th century.
Wow. I didn't know that.
There was something you had mentioned, Derek, about the significance of September 11th before 2001. You'd mentioned it in an email, so I'd like to get both of you guys' perspective. But Derek, you had mentioned a certain battle in particular that I think it was involving the Hussars, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I don't want to jump ahead of Gary though, because Gary hasn't addressed that other question there on eschatology. But we're happy to jump into that, because that 9/11 of 339 years ago was pretty significant.
Yeah. Okay, we'll come back. We'll dog ear that. Yeah, Gary, your response.
Yeah, so I think we're in the fig tree generation, and I think we're in the age of the birth pangs, and those are going to get stronger, just as they'll get stronger through the last 7 years. I don't believe rapture has occurred yet. I do believe in a rapture. My heart is pre-trib. My research leans me to somewhere mid-trib to slightly after. Definitely before the wrath, definitely before the millennium. Not a faith issue for me. It's just we need to be prepared for both, because we're told to watch, but we don't know the exact hour, and it ought not to be a wedge issue with Christians. So prepare for both. And it's probably the best bet to do. And so I think that it's important to understand end time prophecy. I really, really do. It's important not to get ahead of end time chronology, and not to be predicting dates, and not to get events out of order. And to, if I were to give wisdom, if I have any, to people that are into eschatology or just trying to learn about it, is that don't go for a preconceived conclusion. Let the research unfold, and do a couple other things that I would encourage people to do. I have 10 points I think I've shared with you in the past on the show, but put everything around what Jesus said, not vice versa. Put Paul's prophecies ahead of what Jesus said. They all get defined by what Jesus said.
That's good.
And don't leave out inconvenient passages.
Yeah, and it's so easy to do that, and the temptation is always so strong.
Because it's got to mesh perfectly.
Yeah, and it does if you have the heart and the humility to spend the time doing that.
Well, that process will allow you to make the adjustments, because we're not perfect, right? I mean, you're going to learn. You're on a path. You get more information. You need to be open to the fact that you're not a prophet, and that You may be in communication and ought to be in communication with the Holy Spirit, Jesus, and God, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be the Elijah. So let's just let's make sure that we're not discrediting what we're doing and not dividing ourselves, but being understand what we agree on and say, okay, we can agree to disagree on that.
Yeah. There was one question that we had in the chat that I thought was pretty cool. Maybe just kind of a fun one. I don't know, but I would like to get Derek and Gary's input on it. I think it's a little bit farther up. I can remember it more or less.
Oh, yeah.
So it's probably more of a conspiracy theory at this point than anything else, but I think we've discussed it briefly with you guys in the past. One of the many. That doesn't narrow it down at all. I'm sorry.
I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's just all theory.
I like it a lot, and I think it's really cool and really weird. So 9/11 happens. We go to war. It becomes sort of maybe an excuse to get into Iraq. And then there's that video that surfaced of them excavating the corpse of Nimrod or possibly Gilgamesh. And there was a question in here where someone was very curious to get your guys' input onto whether or not Gilgamesh and Nimrod were maybe comparable in some sort of way, or if they were equitable.
Gary, you want to tackle that one first?
Sure. So there was a release, I believe it was at the end of the Obama term from the Department of State, and in that release, it actually has them finding what they believe might be Gilgamesh's tomb. So that is legitimate. It came out in a mass sort of release of information. Wow. So what they're looking for, what they're trying to do with that, there's a lot of speculation. That's all we have is speculation. And one would suspect that sarcophagi might be involved. Sarcophagi has a lot of mythos about it, from not only the treasures are in there, but was it something more? Was it designed to preserve bodies? Was it designed to heal? All sorts of different things. So if there's a technology that they might have been interested in, that might have been one of the keys. Might have been the DNA that they were interested in, if they could find some DNA off of that. So yeah, there's some solid evidence to the fact that they did that, unless it was just disinformation, which the government
they're good at
that. Not too bad at that. Yes. So as far as Nimrod and Gilgamesh being the same, I would say no. Basically, Gilgamesh is 6th generation son of Lugabanda, and the mother goddess is Nin or Ninsun, as some of the translations would produce it. And so, yes, a king of Uruk, just as Nimrod was a king of Erech or Uruk, which I believe is the same city, as you take that back etymologically back, and in Shinar, where Nimrod was, which is Sumer. And so there's a relationship there. There's a kin, but they're a few generations apart. But there is an individual that is 3rd generation that is reigning in that region, and 3rd generation in the king's list after the flood, who is Enmerkar, and there's a couple different variations on how to pronounce that, depending on whether you're using Sumerian or Babylonian. And what's interesting to him is he's 3rd generation as Nimrod is, and he built a tower at Eridu, and it's a polytheist version of the whole story that seems to be more akin. If you're looking for a Sumerian counterpart, I would look at Enmerkar. And if people want to get a hold of me, I have a document on that, and I'll send it to you.
That's one of the beautiful things about Gary is, like, if you have any questions, Gary's got like a back catalog of documents and files.
30 years of research.
Dude, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And, like, all you do is just email him through the website, right?
Yeah.
Genesis6conspiracy.com, and like he'll just send it to you. Yeah.
So awesome.
Derek, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree, Gary, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think we're right. And a friend of ours, Dr. Doug Petrovich, has also said the same thing, and he's a credentialed archaeologist. So I think we're on the right track there. That temple at Eridu was the temple of the god Enki, which is a compound word that means Lord of the earth, or maybe God of this world, perhaps. Anyway, it was the temple that was over the Abzu, which is the Sumerian word from which we get the Greek word, from which we get the English word abyss. And it was from the Abzu that Enki, who was the clever god who in Sumerian and Babylonian myth was, or religion, was always friendly towards humanity. Unlike the other gods, you could never tell when they would bless you or smite you. Enki was always friendly towards humanity. He's the one who warned the Sumerian or Akkadian equivalent of Noah, Utnapishtim or Atrahasis, about the flood, in violation of the dictate by the god Enlil. Don't tell the humans. We're going to kill them all because they keep me awake all night with their noise. And Enki, according to the story, went to a wall knowing that this character, Atrahasis, was on the other side of the wall. And he said, "Oh, wall, if only you knew a flood was coming." Something to that effect, which is, why he built the boat and was saved. Anyway, Enki is also supposed to have sent forth the supernatural sages called the Apkallu, which is a Sumerian word that breaks down to big water man. They came from the abyss. And they brought with them the gifts of civilization to humanity. And these are the characters that you see depicted as a humanoid with wings. One is like an eagle-headed humanoid with wings. And the third is the guy wearing the fish cloak, who's been incorrectly identified as either Dagon or the priest of Dagon for 160 years. Alexander Hislop is responsible for that in his book, The Two Babylons. He meant well, but he was mistaken about this. That fish cloak guy.
Yeah, exactly, Diane. They want a lot of attention. But that's okay. I love giving it to them.
I was one of the three types of Apkallu. Back in 1999, actually not that far back, around 2010, an Estonian scholar by the name of Amar Anus wrote a paper on the Apkallu and showed that they were the Mesopotamian concept of the Watchers. In other words, the Mesopotamians knew who the Watchers were. They just called them Apkallu. And while they gave the gifts of civilization to humanity, they could also be dangerous. And interestingly, in one of their stories called the Epic of Era, which tells how the war god Era went...
I'm going to call in the Squizzer now. That's clever.
Psychotic and started leveling everything and destroying everything. There's one section of that story where the god Marduk, who was the chief god of Babylon and Akkad at that time, Sumer and Akkad, lost his temper and let a flood destroy the world. And afterwards, he sent the Apkallu down to the Abzu, the abyss, and told them never to return. Wow. Well, this is just like the angels who sinned, according to Peter and Jude, referring to the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, and how because of their sin, which if you read those chapters in context, 2 Peter and Jude, it's clear with sexual sin that they are now in the abyss, in the bottomless pit, in chains and gloomy darkness. The word translated hell in 2 Peter 2, verse 4 is Tartaros, which is not Hades, it's a level below Hades, reserved for supernatural rebels. So you've got some interesting parallels between the stories of ancient Mesopotamia and what the Hebrews believed and what is in the Bible, which is, of course, why skeptics say, well, the Hebrews just stole their religion from Mesopotamia.
Yeah, I heard that all the time in ordination class. They would talk about that like they cribbed together, they pieced it together from all this. Yeah, it was
and
a great ordination class, let me tell you.
For everybody that is listening out there, don't let those wedge issues that the polytheists throw in try and weaken your faith.
Yeah.
We can accept that there are older stories that come out of polytheism than what we have that come down in the Bible, because the Bible is 100% accurate, and that would make some of those things like the Epic of Gilgamesh or antediluvian documentation that the atheism absolutely accurate, because the Torah comes to us in the time of Moses. Those other versions would have to be older surviving, because you're looking at about 1450 to 1500 BC when Moses receives the accounting, right? So, don't let
I was going to throw a question at you, Gary. I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt, but there was a thought that came to my mind as you were talking about all this, because the Abzu and this idea that these sages came out of the abyss with this forbidden knowledge that humanity wasn't supposed to have, besides the commingling with human women. Have you done any research on the origins, the point of origin of the Sumerians? In other words, they didn't just spring up there in southeast Iraq, but if not, where did they come from?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a very, very good question as to where do they come from. Let me just sort of swing back. I wanted to double tap on some of the stuff that you were talking about in terms of these watcher individuals. And another word for watcher in Sumerian is,
guys, it's not my sound bar crackling. It's Gary Wayne's. It only crackles when he talks, so I can't help that.
Gigi, which is I, as in to watch, right? And there's 4 groups of watchers, right? There's the Ophanim, there's the cherubim, there's the archangels, and there's the seraphim. So there's several groups of watchers, and one presumes or deduces that likely some of each of the orders, not just the watchers, but the other orders would have rebelled as well. So you get depictions of these different kinds of gods than the serpent gods, right? And what was mentioned would be these not serpentine gods, but these ones with like raven or eagle heads, for example. And you get an identical depiction of them with a human head. And then you get things like a sphinx, which is thought to have maybe a lion's head. And then you get the cherubs that are in Syria and Turkey and other parts of the Middle East that have an ox's head or a bull's head. Those are the different faces of a cherubim watcher. And typically, as they're depicted in the physical world, they're only depicted with one of their faces. And all you're seeing is those different depictions as the same being and part of the watcher ones that would have rebelled. And what's also interesting is just as you have the cherubim pulling in the vision in Ezekiel that Ezekiel has, where you have the cherubim are pulling the chariot of God, and that's where the mythos from the alien mythos, the chariot of gods comes from. And in the Book of Psalms, you have.
That's unusual, Diane. They're spraying after they've been fixed. I think that's unusual, isn't it?
Actually pull it to be more accurate, that chariot that's depicted in Ezekiel. You have a depiction in polytheism of Zeus's chariot and Apollo's chariot being pulled by, one is being white stallions, and the other one is a sort of a white stallion chimera with a unicorn head. And unicorn in occultism is thought to be a angelic being of some sort, a very high angelic being. That's their allegory of the third eye and the knowledge that these cherubim bring that comes from the throne of the cherubim. And so when we look at witnessing of these types of beings throughout polytheism, we ought to expect that they're setting up the counterfeit religion, the counterfeit throne room, the counterfeit council of gods, the counterfeit everything that is if we look at things through the proper lens, it actually just testifies to the accuracy of the Bible. Now, I'm sorry, Derek, the question was, have I come across the
original homeland of the Sumerians?
Right. So, where do they come from? They kind of come out of nowhere with an instantaneous culture, instantaneous language, and instantaneous technology, and an instantaneous pantheon of gods. And they're not really sort of accounted for in secular history. It's kind of almost like a human oopart, right? It's out of place. It doesn't fit. They don't want to account for it. I actually, tend to think that they're probably more of the day 6 people than the Adamites. And I look at day 6 as being a different creation because the details are different than what's in Genesis 2. And I think there are either 3 or 4 races that are created in multiple in day 6. And I think that's part of that race. And the Adamites, even though Adam and man from Genesis 1 comes from the same word of Adam, they're the same species, but he's either a different race or he is just a specific man of one of the races that is being recreated or being created, I'm sorry, and given a special commission, which is the resolution of the angelic rebellion, whom the people of day 6 would have worshipped. So from my perspective, where they would come from, it better fits for me with the details, because I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction in any iota. It just adds more information, and we need to understand it that way.
Yeah.
That these people of day 6 were worshiping as angels for, a few thousand years, perhaps. We don't know whether or not Adam is created in this scenario that I'm laying out, on day 8, with the year being a 1,000 years, as the book of Peter talks about, or it's even later than that. So you could have, even without getting into gap theory and stuff like that, you could have a little bit older Earth and a little bit more separation of time and development of the civilizations and how they got there than is typically taught in standard sort of dogma. So I think that they are part of the day 6 people, and that there would have been other civilizations as well, with the different races, and that they got, and in all of the civilizations, they received their knowledge from the gods. So whether or not you have a Greek antediluvian civilization, which they do, or one that's over in India that they did, or anywhere around the world, I think that's a reflection of those people of day 6 that, didn't spend time in Eden, and you had male and female created at the same time and were told to multiply and spread out around the world, and weren't permitted to not eat from a specific tree.
Would they be image bearers, though? It seems like they might not be, if that's true.
You mean idolaters?
Well, created in the image of God, or created as his image bearer.
Yeah, I think they were. I think they are. So, I mean, that's what the Bible says. They're created in his image. So I think they were. I just think that Adam is created in a different way, and having that special spirit breathed into them. So I think, a lot of people in this line of theory think that the people of day 6, they only have a soul and a body and not a spirit because of that. I get that argument. I'm not convinced of it, because they're made in the image of God, who's spirit.
Yeah, right.
So you would have had a spirit, they would have had a soul, and they would have had a body, just as Adam did. I just think they were misled, but God wanted to start anew with something uncorrupted, just as God was looking to start anew with Abraham, and then anew with the descendants of Abraham, to create a new nation, to bring about the Messiah. That's not an unknown sort of MO of how everything sort of plays out in the Bible. So yeah, I think they're part of day 6 is the short answer.
Interesting,
man.
Interesting.
What's so cool about this is, like, I did a end of year report on the gap theory when I was like a senior in high school or something, whatever. So I'm familiar with the gap theory in and of itself. But up until this moment, I don't think I've ever heard of the day 6 theory before.
I have a document if people want to get a hold of me.
Yeah.
just points out all of the difference, and I also have it put on a chart as well of the verses. So
I would love to have that. I'll send you an email whenever we're done with that, because I would love to take a look at that. I've never heard of. I mean, it makes sense, especially when you hear about it referenced, I guess, every now and then when people talk about, Cain and being marked, and then going out, into, beyond his dwelling place, and these marks, people don't touch him, and it's always like, well, who are those people? Is that kind of does that tie back into the day 6 people, as far as being those people that Cain is now going out to and is protected by, or is that something else?
Well, I think I think you're referring to Cain and his special mark to be protected by God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he goes to Nod. Nod's a place.
Yeah.
And there's people there because he gets a wife almost immediately. And Seth's not born until Adam's 130 years. And Cain seems to leave a lot earlier from, after killing Abel. It's almost like they're offering the first fruits, and it's part of their ritual of adulthood. And we don't know how long that period is in terms of how Adam and Eve are in Eden. We don't know how long of a period it is until they're born. But there just seems to be a period there where he's still younger than when Seth is born, because Seth is born afterwards as the Bible lays itself out. And daughters and sons aren't born until to Adam and Eve until after Seth. So where does the wife come from? Who is the city that Cain is building this city for? Why is he building cities with walls? Who is he protecting himself from? So it just things just seem to fit better. I'm open to being wrong on it, but one of my values is I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. So I can't account for that in a logical way unless there's two different creations, but there just seems to be.
Interesting.
So the reason I asked that question, and I put the reset, and by the way, those globalists who may ever stumble across this video someday, God has a greater reset coming.
That's right.
That's the truth. I put the reset after the flood, and the archaeological research that I've been following suggests that the Sumerian word Abzu, from which we get abyss, actually derives from an older word in the Hurrian language, and the Horites of the Bible, who can be traced through a very unique style of pottery. It's again, it's sort of like a type find. Whenever they find a certain type of red on black pottery, they know, these are the Hurrians and the people before them, called the Kura-Araxes civilization. And they are so named because the rivers that run on either side of the Caucasus Mountains in Armenia are the Kura and the Araxes. So they trace this civilization that seem to have invented this idea that you need to summon the spirits from the netherworld using a necromantic ritual pit called the Abi, Sumerian Abzu, Hebrew Ov, the word translated into English as medium. When Saul visited the medium of Endor, he visited the Ov of Endor. She had a ritual pit because the Elohim of Samuel came up from the earth. They traced their origin back to the Ararat Plain in the middle of the 5th millennium BC. So sometime after the flood, in the plains below the mountains where Noah and the family landed the ark, comes this practice of summoning spirits who now are believed to be on the other side, or deep in the earth. The Hurrians also had this idea of a divine waterway that they called the Cascal, which is similar to the idea of the river Styx, or in Sumerian, it would be the river Huber. This idea that the gods are on the other side of the water and deep in the earth, which makes sense if we're comparing this to biblical history, where these entities who drew humanity into worshiping them and commingling with them got punished by a massive flood that killed the giants, the Nephilim, and their fathers, their parents, were punished by being condemned to Tartarus, which is a theme that appears not only in all of the Greek and Roman myths, but you see it in Sumerian, where the great gods of Sumer, the Anunnaki, were by the time of Abraham demoted to judges of the netherworld. Even the great god Enlil, who was the father of the gods, by the time of David and Solomon, he'd been replaced by Marduk, and Enlil was among the judges of the netherworld. Just like Kronos of the Greeks and the Titans were condemned to Tartarus, and Saturn and the Titans of the perpetual rebels. So you've got some interesting parallels between the stories of ancient Mesopotamia and what the Hebrews believed and what is in the Bible, which is, of course, why skeptics say, well, the Hebrews just stole their religion from Mesopotamia.
Yeah, I heard that all the time in ordination class.
We were talking about that.
Like they cribbed together, they pieced it together from all this. Yeah, it was
and
not a great ordination class, let me tell you.
For everybody that is listening out there, don't let those wedge issues that the polytheists throw in try and weaken your faith.
Yeah,
we can accept that there are older stories that come out of polytheism than what we have that come down in the Bible, because the Bible is 100% accurate, and that would make some of those things like the Epic of Gilgamesh or antediluvian documentation that the atheism absolutely accurate, because the Torah comes to us in the time of Moses. Those other versions would have to be older surviving, because you're looking at about 1450 to 1500 BC when Moses receives the accounting, right? So, don't let the
I was going to throw a question at you, Gary. I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt, but there was a thought that came to my mind as you were talking about all this, because the Abzu and this idea that these sages came out of the abyss with this forbidden knowledge that humanity wasn't supposed to have, besides the commingling with human women. Have you done any research on the origins, the point of origin of the Sumerians? In other words, they didn't just spring up there in southeast Iraq, but if not, where did they come from?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a very, very, very good question as to where do they come from. Let me just sort of swing back. I wanted to double tap on some of the stuff that you were talking about in terms of these watcher individuals. And another word for watcher in Sumerian is Gigi, which is eye, as in to watch, right? And there's 4 groups of watchers, right? There's the Ophanim, there's the cherubim, there's the archangels, and there's the seraphim. So there's several groups of watchers, and one presumes or deduces that likely some of each of the orders, not just the watchers, but the other orders would have rebelled as well. So you get depictions of these different kinds of gods than the serpent gods, right? Then what was mentioned would be these not serpentine gods, but these ones with like raven or eagle heads, for example. And you get an identical depiction of them with a human head. And then you get things like a sphinx, which is thought to have maybe a lion's head. And then you get the cherubs that are in Syria and Turkey and other parts of the Middle East that have an ox's head or a bull's head. Those are the different faces of a cherubim watcher. And typically, as they're depicted in the physical world, they're only depicted with one of their faces. And all you're seeing is those different depictions as the same being, and part of the watcher ones that would have rebelled. And what's also interesting is just as you have the cherubim pulling in the vision in Ezekiel that Ezekiel has, where you have the cherubim are pulling the chariot of God, and that's where the mythos from the alien mythos, the chariot of gods, comes from. And in the Book of Psalms, you have them actually pull it to be more accurate, that chariot that's depicted in the book of Ezekiel. You have a depiction in polytheism of Zeus's chariot and Apollo's chariot being pulled by, one is being white stallions, and the other one is sort of a white stallion chimera with a unicorn head. And the unicorn in occultism is thought to be a angelic being of some sort, a very high angelic being. That's their allegory of the third eye and the knowledge that these cherubim bring, that comes from the throne of the cherubim. And so when we look at witnessing of these types of beings throughout polytheism, we ought to expect that they're setting up the counterfeit religion, the counterfeit throne room, the counterfeit council of gods, the counterfeit everything that is if we look at things through the proper lens, it actually just testifies to the accuracy of the Bible. Now, I'm sorry, Derek, the question was, have I come across the
original homeland of the Sumerians?
Right. So, where do they come from? They kind of come out of nowhere with an instantaneous culture, instantaneous language, and instantaneous technology, and an instantaneous pantheon of gods. And they're not really sort of accounted for in secular history. It's kind of almost like a human oopart, right? It's out of place. It doesn't fit. They don't want to account for it. I actually, tend to think that they're probably more of the day 6 people than the Adamites. And I look at day 6 as being a different creation, because the details are different than what's in Genesis 2. And I think these are there are either 3 or 4 races that are created in multiple in day 6, and I think that's part of that race. And the Adamites, even though Adam and man from Genesis 1 comes from the same word of Adam, they're the same species, but he's either a different race or he is just a specific man of one of the races that is being recreated or being created, and given a special commission, which is the resolution of the angelic rebellion, whom the people of day 6 would have worshipped. So from my perspective, where they would come from, it better fits for me with the details, because I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction in any iota. Just adds more information, and we need to understand it that way.
Yeah.
That these people of day 6 were worshiping those angels for, a few thousand years, perhaps. We don't know whether or not Adam is created in this scenario that I'm laying out, on day 8. With the year being a 1,000 years, as the book of Peter talks about, or it's even later than that. So you could have, even without getting into gap theory and stuff like that, you could have a little bit older Earth and a little bit more separation of time and development of the civilizations and how they got there than is typically taught in standard sort of dogma. So I think that they are part of the day 6 people, and that there would have been other civilizations as well, with the different races, and that they and in all of the civilizations, they received their knowledge from the gods. So whether or not you have a Greek antediluvian civilization, which they do, or one that's over in India that they did, or anywhere around the world, I think that's a reflection of those people of day 6 that, didn't spend time in Eden, and male and female created at the same time, and were told to multiply and spread out around the world, and weren't permitted to not eat from a specific tree.
Would they be image bearers, though? It seems like they might not be, if that's true.
You mean idolaters?
Well, created in the image of God, or created as His image bearer.
Yeah, I think they were. I think they are. So, I mean, that's what the Bible says. They're created in His image, so I think they were. I just think that Adam is created in a different way, and having that special spirit breathed into them. So I think, a lot of people in this line of theory think that the people of day 6, they only have a soul and a body and not a spirit because of that. I get that argument. I'm not convinced of it, because they're made in the image of God, who's spirit.
Yeah. Right.
So you would have had a spirit, they would have had a soul, and they would have had a body, just as Adam did. I just think they were misled, but God wanted to start anew with something uncorrupted, just as God was looking to start anew with Abraham, and then anew with the descendants of Abraham, to create a new nation, to bring about the Messiah. That's not an unknown sort of MO of how everything sort of plays out in the Bible. So yeah, I think they're part of day 6 is the short answer.
Interesting,
man.
Interesting.
What's so cool about this is, like, I did a end of year report on the gap theory when I was like a senior in high school or something, whatever. So I'm familiar with the gap theory in and of itself, but up until this moment, I don't think I've ever heard of the day 6 theory before.
I have a document if people want to get a hold of me.
Yeah.
Just points out all of the difference. I also have it put on a chart as well of the verses. So
I would love to have that. I'll send you an email whenever we're done with that, because I would love to take a look at that. I've never heard of. I mean, it makes sense, especially when you hear about it referenced, I guess, every now and then when people talk about Cain and being marked, and then going out, into, beyond his dwelling place, and he's marked so people don't touch him, and it's always like, well, who are those people? Is that kind of does that tie back into the day 6 people, as far as being those people that Cain is now going out to and is protected by, or is that something else?
Well, I think I think you're referring to Cain and his special mark to be protected by God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he goes to Nod. Nod's a place.
Yeah.
And there's people there because he gets a wife almost immediately. And Seth's not born until Adam's 130 years, and Cain seems to leave a lot earlier from, after killing Abel. It's almost like they're offering the first fruits, and it's part of their ritual of adulthood. And we don't know how long that period is in terms of how Adam and Eve are in Eden. We don't know how long of a period it is until they're born. But there just seems to be a period there where he's still younger than when Seth is born, because Seth is born afterwards, as the Bible lays itself out. And daughters and sons aren't born until to Adam and Eve until after Seth. So where does the wife come from? Who is the city that Cain is building this city for? Why is he building cities with walls? Who is he protecting himself from? So it just things just seem to fit better. I'm open to being wrong on it, but one of my values is I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. So I can't account for that in a logical way unless there's two different creations, which there just seems to be.
Interesting. So the reason I asked that question, and I put the reset, and by the way, those globalists who may ever stumble across this video someday, God has a greater reset coming.
That's right.
That's the truth.
I put the reset after the flood, and the archaeological research that I've been following suggests that the Sumerian word Abzu, from which we get abyss, actually derives from an older word in the Hurrian language, and the Horites of the Bible, who can be traced through a very unique style of pottery. It's again sort of like a type find. Whenever they find a certain type of red on black pottery, they know these are the Hurrians and the people before them, called the Kura-Araxes civilization. And they are so named because the rivers that run on either side of the Caucasus Mountains in Armenia are the Kura and the Araxes. So they trace this civilization that seem to have invented this idea that you need to summon the spirits from the netherworld using a necromantic ritual pit called the Abi, Sumerian Abzu, Hebrew Ov, the word translated into English as medium. When Saul visited the medium of Endor, he visited the Ov of Endor. She had a ritual pit because the Elohim of Samuel came up from the earth. They traced their origin back to the Ararat Plain in the middle of the 5th millennium BC. So sometime after the flood, in the plains below the mountains where Noah and the family landed the ark, comes this practice of summoning spirits who now are believed to be on the other side, or deep in the earth. The Hurrians also had this idea of a divine waterway that they called the Cascal, which is similar to the idea of the river Styx, or in Sumerian, it would be the river Huber. This idea that the gods are on the other side of the water and deep in
this bit's looped a bit. He's already said this.
The earth, which makes sense if we're comparing this to biblical history, where these entities who drew humanity into worshiping them and commingling with them got punished by a massive flood that killed the giants, the Nephilim, and their fathers, their parents were punished by being condemned to Tartarus, which is a theme that appears not only in all of the Greek and Roman myths, but you see it in Sumerian, where the great gods of Sumer, the Anunnaki, were by the time of Abraham demoted to judges of the netherworld. Even the great god Enlil, who was the father of the gods, by the time of David and Solomon, he'd been replaced by Marduk, and Enlil was among the judges of the netherworld. Just like Kronos of the Greeks and the Titans were condemned to Tartarus, and Saturn and the Titans of the Romans were in the netherworld. They found back in the 1940s that the Hurrians, again, an older civilization, that just within the last 20 years, archaeologists are realizing, hey, they were developing cities in northern Mesopotamia and like the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Turkey and Syria, at the same time that Uruk and Ur and Eridu were being built in the south. The Hurrians had the same story. Their god who got sent to the netherworld is named Kumarbi, and the storm god who became the king of the gods is named Teshub. The Greeks and the Romans got the story from him, and it appears that the Sumerians may have gotten the story from the Hurrians as well. In other words, if you track biblical history, worldwide flood, down to 8 people come off the ark in Armenia, and that's where these Hurrians come from, and it appears that the religion of the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Canaanites, all seem to spread out from that same geographic region. Now, again, it's circumstantial evidence, but a friend of ours, Dr. Judd Burton, did a study, an etymological study on the word Refaim, and found that the phonemes, the little pieces of language that form the basis of the words for royalty or rulers in most of the Eurasian languages, like Rex in Latin or Roi in French. 12 years of French in high school and all come from this like these little pieces of language. The R consonant followed by a vowel, and either the P or B consonant. In Akkadian, that turns into Raba'um, which is probably the word from which Rephaim comes from, meaning the great ones. But the origin
and Rab in Hebrew.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Rab in Hebrew, exactly. And the origin point, according to Judd, was the region between the Caucasus, or the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea, which again is that same region in the plains of Ararat in Armenia. So this idea that these god kings that had to be worshipped was preserved by those 8 people who were on the ark, and it wasn't very long before that same practice, like, okay, we got to get back in touch with the old gods in the abyss, which I think, Gary, is why Enmerkar was trying to rebuild that temple over the Abzu in Eridu.
Sure, and if you look at the word Babel in Akkadian, that is gateway of the gods, the Babalu.
Right.
And that was more of a technology. A lot of really good things that I agree with that you're talking about. Yes, the Horim for sure are the Hurrians, and they're part of the Rephaim. And that when you look at that combination of R-A-P, R-A-B, you see that with Amarabi or Amarapi, it's transliterated both sort of ways.
Right.
And you have the Rapiu or the Rapium and that would be RPM in the Old Semitic, out of the Ugaritic texts, that were these kings that were actually praying to Baal and Ashtaroth to reproduce more giants, just because they were part of the terrible ones, and the terrible ones, that's the word Eretz. I like to sort of transliterate it with the IM on it as being plural as Ariam, but that's just me. But one of the interesting things in the words of Eretz for the terrible ones, which is a branch, as they're described, of terrible ones in Isaiah 25, is that you have several different meanings of being strong, mighty, things like that, but also childless and having struggles with, populating as the definition comes out. And that's one of the reasons why they had to intermingle with humans, because unlike the Nephilim before the flood, they seem to have had this fertility issue, and they're doing fertility rituals in the Ugaritic text to bring Baal and Ashtaroth back, to create more of them, because they believe that's who they were created from the Baalim off of Mount Hermon. And in the Ugaritic text, which equates to the passengers, a bar and crossing over out of Ezekiel 39.
Travelers.
These travelers, they traveled between both the gods and the demigods. The Rapium traveled not only for funerary rites, but at other times, at certain times of the year, they traveled between the underworld and the earth through these portals and these gateways. So there's a strong tradition of all of these different kinds of peoples, these kinds of gods, that is consistent throughout the Middle East and the world that's described in the Bible, and that even the Ark account is part of polytheism. You can view it as a counterfeit of the Noah story, or you can view it as a giant survival story, because Utnapishtim, Zayazudra, Atrahasis, all the different names for the Sumerian Noah, as they like to call him, he is described in the Epic of Gilgamesh as being 2/3 God and 1/3 human, just as Gilgamesh is, just as Enkidu is, and just as the Greek Noah, quote unquote, Deucalion, is the son of Prometheus. So again, you've got the same thing going on there, and those are, whether they're counterfeits or not, are a parallel story of the survival of giants, or you believe that giants are recreated. Polytheism believes both, by the way. And so in the Gilgamesh story, you have the survival of the whole family of Utnapishtim, and they're all archetypical Nephilim as well, all 2/3 God and 1/3 human. And you have Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which are second incursion, creation of giants after the flood that we talked about earlier. So, you know, we don't have a biblical verse how giants survive, but we know they show up after the flood. I lean towards second incursion, but I'm open to other ways because we don't have that smoking gun verse. And who knows, it just might be both. But there's a distinction between the Refaim and the Nephilim. That's the one thing that we do know. And biblically, we don't get Refaim before the flood, and technically we don't get Nephilim after the flood, except for the embellished part of the Anak, who are the Anak are giants, or Rephaim as they're described in Deuteronomy 2, not Nephilim. And so when you see the children of giants in Numbers 13:33, that's the embellishment part of the report, but it testifies to the veracity of the size of these giants before the flood, that they're comparing them to the Nephilim to scare the Israelites. But the Anak that are accurately described in the accurate part of the report that Joshua and Caleb present, and then part of some of the details that's earlier on, and then reiterated in Deuteronomy 1 by Moses, is that there are the Anak, and then the children of Anak, not the children of giants. So the children of the Anakim, or Anak might be one of four that you would be included, but he's not the patriarch of the Anakim, because that's Arba, as the book of Joshua tells us, and that the giants are. So I guess the point of that is that the Nephilim, other than those three places, are not located in the Bible. You only get 3 references to Nephilim, and so the only accurate reference to the Nephilim is before the flood. So there's something different, but that doesn't mean they didn't somehow survive. But there seems to be a second incursion that comes after the flood, and that I think we need to be, again, like I said, we need to be open of that, and that the Rephaim tribes, and there are many of these tribes, they are the identical kinds of people with their red hair and their pale skin that are part of, the Indo-Aryan groups that they like to talk about escaping out of Tartarus after the flood. And there's 4 groups, but one of them is that dark-haired group. And again, so we don't know whether or not perhaps they are the ones that survive, or they're just a different kind of Rephaim that are created after the flood.
Our theory, Sharon and I are working on a theory that the Hurrians, the Amorites, and the Greeks are all interconnected back in history somehow.
Oh, they are, right back to Cadmus.
Yeah. A lot of Greek mythology, people don't realize, is actually derives from Phoenician. Cadmus was a Phoenician hero, but the Phoenicians were just the Amorites by a different name, as were the Babylonians. The Amorites really controlled the ancient Near East between the time of Abraham, around 2000 BC, and about the time of the Exodus, around 1400 BC. Interestingly, that scholar I mentioned earlier, Amar Anus, 1999, wrote a paper called "Were There Greek Rephaim?" And he pointed out that the phrase used by the poets Homer and Hesiod, from whom we get most of what we know about ancient Greek religion, to describe the men who lived during the golden age when Kronos ruled in heaven. Okay, so the Titans, or the Watchers of the Hebrew story, First Enoch, the Apkallu of Mesopotamian myth, before Marduk sent them down to the Abzu. The phrase Moropes anthropoi, okay, anthropoi, anthropological, humana, okay, that's where we get the word anthropology and all that, study of humanity. Moropes derives from the same Semitic root from which we get Rephaim. The Greeks knew who the Rephaim were, and they placed them as the demigod heroes of the pre-flood era. What's even more interesting is that in this paper, which I had to read like 12 times to get my head around it, is that he mentions, Dr. Anus mentions in passing that there was an ancient Amorite tribe by the name of the Tadanu, who were so feared by the ancient Sumerians, the last kings of Sumer who dominated Mesopotamia, the third dynasty of Ur, built a wall from modern-day Baghdad from the Euphrates across the Tigris to another river called the Diyala, like a 175-mile-long wall.
Jeez.
To keep the Tadanu out of southern Mesopotamia. And we know this because they literally named it in the Sumerian texts, the Amorite wall that keeps the Tadanu away. The problem is it didn't. And so 2004 BC, the last Ur kingdom was destroyed by the Tadanu and the Gudians who came from the highlands of Iran and so forth. But move forward about 800 years to the time of the Judges, and the Amorite kingdom of Ugarit, which is in northern Syria on the Mediterranean coast, very close to Mount Zaphon, which is where everyone knew Baal's palace was located. It's where Zeus wrestled the chaos god Typhon. There is a text there that, and Gary, you know this. This is the ritual text that summons the Refaim to a ritual feast for the last. It was the coronation of the last king of Ugarit before it was destroyed by the Sea Peoples, and it mentions the Council of the Datanu, which is just another way of spelling Tadanu. And Dr. Anus said this is the etymological origin of the Greek Titans. It's the ancient Amorite tribe called the Tadanu, which is derived from an Akkadian word for aurochs, or ox, or bull. So you get these interconnections between Greek and Hurrian and Akkadian and Sumerian. In fact, Anak, the Anakim, there was a paper by a scholar by the name of Lloyd Bailey, 1966, who showed that this is actually archaic Greek. It's a word that means high king. Amongst the gods, Zeus was the Anax, he was the high king, and the others were, Basilia, from which we get basilisk. In the story of the Trojan War, Agamemnon was the Anax, and the other kings like Odysseus were Basilia. So the Anakim were apparently Greek mercenaries or Greek military commanders who ruled the highlands of Israel and Judah in the time of Joshua. Regardless, certainly when you read Joshua 11, I believe it's Joshua 11, the end of Joshua 11, where he summarizes the war, it was basically directed against cleaning out the Anakim from the highlands. Yep. So, but there's a lot of cross-pollination. We start looking at this and realize that you've got all of these descendants of Japheth who were mixed up in there with the Shemites and the Hamites. It shouldn't surprise us that the stories of Greece and Rome, and of the Hittites and the Hurrians from the north, and the Akkadians and the Babylonians from the east, all have the same pattern when you begin to look at them.
Yep. And the Egyptians called them the Lanak. And you look at that tribe of Datanu, that's also transliterated as the Tuatha Danu, the tribe of Danu, which is the same as the Tuatha De Danann. And they were blonde-haired and red-haired, blue-eyed and red, hazel-eyed. And the Amorites were typically recorded as light-haired and fair-skinned, as opposed to the Horim that were red-haired and fair-skinned. Yeah. And so it's the same sort of groups of people, and that the Amorites, and Derek has written about this, and I've as I recall, at least in a couple of shows that we did, you were talking about it, and I cover the Amorites in my upcoming book.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I think you'll like some of the parts on it. Is that not only were they in the covenant land, but they had portions of power into Mesopotamia, and that they do not have a patriarch that's listed. They're one of the 9 patriarchless nations. And so they are not Rephaim, they are a hybrid human Rephaim and listed as a Canaanite family. And the god Amar, or Amaru, and there's a few different transliterations, is thought to be where the Amorites take their name from. So whether or not that was a Rephaim name Amaru or it was an actual god, but it's listed as an actual god in most parts. So I think it's probably both. They seem to be part of that Tuatha Dedanan, Tuatha Danu, or the Datanu, as the Ugaritic texts talk about. And yeah, they're talked about in all the different civilizations. And for people that don't know, just to show the cross-pollination, is that the Ugaritic texts have their own version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that shows you the close association between those different giants and things like that. And it's, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe I was reading one that was slightly different. And I thought, well, this is odd. And I find out I'm reading the Ugaritic version as opposed to this, the ones that come out of Sumer. And when we talk about the gods, and we're talking about Enlil and Enki, I mean, not Enlil, but that was the counterpart of Enki. We're talking about Baal and El. We're talking about Zeus and Kronos. You have parent gods and you have offspring gods. And I think one of the things that would help people if they understood that, even though the offspring gods lived in the time of the parent gods, they weren't ruling. So in polytheism, they come up with this story that they overthrew the parent gods and they killed them. Well, you can't kill immortal beings. And Gospels like Pistis Sophia describe these parent gods in these prisons, in the abyss prison, in the underworld, and with some with 7 head, but they're the same type of creatures that we talk about typically, in terms of lions and dogs and jackals and serpents. They're the same type of gods that are in there. What's gone on there, in my opinion, is that, and this really helps me understanding chronology of prehistory, is that at the time of the flood, the parent gods are sent into the abyss for further crimes. Afterwards, the offspring gods like Zeus, like Osiris, like Enki, like Baal, assume control. And they recreate giants, just as Zeus creates Hercules, which seems to be a post-Diluvian giant. Now, there's 2 Hercules, a Hercules and a Hercules, but it's not uncommon for giants to be named after giants before the flood, just as Gilgamesh, that we talk about as being a post-Diluvian giant, is also mentioned in the Enoch book of giants, talking to Enoch, trying to figure out how they're going to prevent the flood. So there's 2 different Gilgameshes. They just like to sort of patronymically name themselves downstream, which is a common trait, particularly after the flood, to follow the history of the giants as patriarchal after names that are named after the giants and after the gods, and patronymically as part of the bloodlines, like the Hadad bloodline dynasty, which is another name for Baal. Yeah, so I know I'm going down a whole bunch of different things, but understand that.
I love it.
And so Baal sets up as with the Baalim after the flood, which the Bible records, right? And that's that council, that's that ruling class of the gods. So if we understand those as post-Diluvian giants who created, or post-Diluvian gods who create post-Diluvian giants, then if they did that, which they did, then they would go to the abyss as well, right? And so there are not all the angels in there. So one would presume that the counterfeit Saba, hosts of heaven, the ones ruling in the council of the gods on the earth, are going to move up like an army does, like an army of angels, as Saba is defined as, and just take over, right? And so it starts to explain why the Ugaritic texts are trying to bring Baal and Ashtaroth back, because they can't turn the abyss.
Was that kind of the central aspect, or you're saying that's the outcome of Baal worship that they were going for, was to bring him back?
Well, that's one of the things that they wanted to do, because as I mentioned earlier, they seem to have had this reproductive fertility issue.
Yeah.
And so they're diminishing in numbers. And the only way they can survive is to create hybrid humans. And they start to intermarry, which is why Nimrod is thought to have intermarried also with the giants in Sumeria that produced some of the royal bloodlines. And so, they're trying to bring those gods back. but they can't. That they can't. So they're going to have to go forward and reproduce. So you get like non-patriarchless Canaanite nations, and you can literally make a case for each one of them, taking it back patriarchally and patronymically back to a Refaim and back to a particular god.
Wow. Yeah, I have actually a follow-up question about the Amorites. Because I recall reading when God sent Abraham to the land of Canaan, he kind of diverts him and says, the time of the Amorites is now fulfilled. Like that was something that needed to happen before the children of Israel 400 years later could come up out of Egypt and Canaan. Like there was something that needed to germinate that had to do with the Amorites. Can you expound on that? Both of you, please weigh in on that.
Let me just sort of finish up on that. I know I went on a couple long rants, but
that's okay.
So in Numbers 13, you get that report of the scouts, and you have the Anakim, and then you have Amalekites, Amorites, Canaanites, and a couple other tribes that are listed. And you're not sure whether or not they're talking about them as giants or just being taller and stronger than the Israelites. But Deuteronomy 1's pretty specific with it, and particularly with the Amorites being listed, that you have the Anak, which are the Refaim, and then you have the ones that are taller than the Israelites. That's the Amorites and the other tribes that were all intermarried. And even the Amalekites, to stand from Timnah, daughter of a whoring seer, marries Eliphaz to produce the Amalekite hybrid race, right? So these are people that are taller. The Egyptians called them the Shazu. Out of the more eastern traditions, they're called the Shemau and the Amal, but they're hybrids is what they are. And so these are people that are the most dominant of the Canaanite tribes. Canaanites would be fairly dominant too, but Amorites are used a lot of times in the Old Testament as a generic name for all of the Canaanites. That's how powerful they were, and they were heavily intermixed, not only into Mount Hermon with Og and Sihon, but also into the southern regions, with the Horim and the Abim and the Hivim and all the ones that are down there. And as Derek said, they also had an influence into the Phoenician dynasties as well, even though the Sidonites are there and there's some other northern tribes. They were that sort of dominant. So, and they're the ones that would have brought the full fruition, along with the Rephaim, of the corruption of the land of the covenant, God's land that he gifted to Israel, reserved for him and for his people, that would have come to a level that would be, let's say, unforgivable and would cause the utter destruction, haram, a curse, a holy ritual of destruction that were going to come on all the Amorites, all of the Canaanites, and all the Rephaim of the various people that refused to leave the land when they were asked to.
And that kind of goes to explain God's mandate to wipe out every man, woman, and child.
Yeah, I think the thing to remember is that we talk about Babylon and, John using Babylon. Mystery Babylon is the great end times church of the Antichrist, that Babylon is not an ethnicity. Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon, was founded around 1894 BC, if I remember the date correctly, by a chieftain, an Amorite chieftain by the name of Sumu Abum. But it wasn't until Hammurabi, around in the 18th century BC, by about 1750 BC, Babylon became what we think of as Babylon. But he was an Amorite. He was an Amorite king. Babylon is an Amorite.
Well, his name says it all.
Yeah. It's funny because most Bible teachers will look at it and say, it means, okay, Amu, that means my family, and Rabbi, that means healer. My family is healers. My father is a healer. No. Rabbi is the theophoric element. That's the God name. And there is nothing in the Bible, and scholars admit this, there's nothing connected to the root behind the word Refaim that has anything to do with healing or restoration or rebirth or regeneration or any way you want to spin it. It's revisionist history. The Raphaim, the Refaim were the great old ones, the mighty men who were of old. What Hammurabi was saying in his name is, my ancestors were the great ones. It was such a popular name that scholars know of at least 6 different kings of the Amorites, besides Hammurabi the Great, whose names was Amorites. In fact, the last king of Gilbert, which was destroyed around 1200 BC, in the middle of the period of the Judges, was Amorites III. So this was a very popular name amongst the Amorites. My fathers were the Refaim, is what the name means.
Wow.
So this is the sin of the Amorites. The occult system of Babylon is the wickedness of the Amorites. In fact, you want to read Leviticus chapter 18. Don't read it out loud with kids in the room, but it describes all the things that they were doing that caused, in God's words, to vomit out the people. The land vomited out its inhabitants. God saying, don't do these things because this is what these people are doing. That is the sin of the Amorites. But this was, as Gary said, they were interconnected with the Horim, the Horites, the Hurrians, apparently the Sumerians as well, and their religious system spread throughout the entire ancient Near East. They were down as far as Oman and the island Bahrain. They were up into southern Turkey, northeastern Iran. They dominated the ancient Near East during the period of the patriarchs. From Abraham down to Moses, the Amorites were the dominant people group of that world. And in fact, we know now from an inscription that was found within the last, I think, 50 years or so at the site of Babylon, from the temple of Marduk, the Entomonanki, that the dimensions of the bed, the cultic bed of Marduk, where it was believed that every year during the Akitu festival, which was an annual festival to celebrate the new year, Marduk would come down and indwell the king, where he would have ritual sex with a priestess representing his consort, Sarpanatu. And this is how they would bless the land, by having this ritual lovemaking. The dimensions of Marduk's bed are exactly the same as the dimensions of the bed of Og of Bashan. Yeah. So I think the point is more than just, Og was exceptionally tall. The point that Moses is making by including the dimensions of Og's bed is that Og, this Amorite king, is connected to the cult system of Babylon and the wickedness of the Amorites. And you wanted something that'll really blow your mind, is that in Numbers 24, which is that messianic prophecy by Balaam, the prophet for prophet, who's hired by the king of Moab to curse the Israelites. This messianic prophecy, Numbers 24, verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. That's a reference to the Messiah and the coming of the Messiah. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Sheth is a reference to the Shazu that Gary mentioned, these people, the Amorite tribes who lived in the desert. They were also called the Suteans. And I found academic research from secular scholars who aren't viewing this with a biblical worldview that say the Suteans, prior to the time of about Abraham in the 19th century BC, were referred to as the Tadanu. In other words, the scepter that shall rise from Israel, the Messiah, which, yes, Jesus, but we're talking about...
No, Diane Gay got a new phone and she's picking a new ringtone.
The second coming now shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of the Tadanu, all the sons of the Titans. In other words, the Nephilim, the Refaim, the travelers, the demonic spirits that survived the flood when the giants' bodies were destroyed and that afflict the world to this day. So we're talking about here the ultimate destruction of demonic entities, in my view. And in fact, when you go down a little further in verse 19, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy all the survivors and destroy the survivors of cities. The word in Hebrew for cities is Irim. Now, what's wrong with cities? I'm from Chicago. I'm glad I'm from there and not in there. But God had David in a city. Built a temple in a city. It wasn't cities. The key is this: the word is identical to the Aramaic word for watchers. Oh wow! Yeah. Oh, wow. We will destroy the survivors of the watchers. Now you can't swap every. In fact, when you look at Daniel chapter 4, and you do this with the Logos Bible software. When Nebuchadnezzar has his dream and watchers come down to decree his punishment, this punishment is by the decree of the watchers, by the decree of the holy ones. You click on that word watchers, and it takes you to the dictionary of deities and demons in the Bible. But same thing happens when you click on the word cities in Numbers 24:17.
Really?
Because again, it's the same word. Now again, you have to be careful. As Gary said, you can't take things out of context. There are places where city means city, but there's another place where I think Isaiah 14, if I remember correctly, where you get the same kind of thing, that it makes more sense to read watchers instead of cities. So there are prophecies in the Old Testament that foretell the destruction of these old gods worshipped by the polytheists and the pagans, and those who are still praying today and trying to work for the new golden age.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the watchers that shows up 4 times in Daniel 4, that goes back to the Hebrew word ayir, I-Y-R, if I got the right transliteration there, but very close to that spelling, might be a W in there as well. And that goes back to another Hebrew word that's essentially pronounced similarly, but I think it's yur with a U as we would get it. And it means to be awake, not to sleep. And these are the watchers. And the watchers around the throne, all 4 of them, they did not sleep. They were watching all the time, which is where the name sort of comes from, which kind of links back to some of the definitions that we're talking about with some of the rebellious watchers. And then that word satyr, those shaggy, hairy goat gods. Well, that's spelled S-I with a little like an apostrophe mark, and then ayir, watcher. So sa is a contracted short form of the word hairy or shaggy, and then ayir, watcher. So these are hairy goat watchers, which I think are degraded watchers down to a goat god status. That is being talked about with the satyrs in Isaiah 34 and Isaiah 13. So that's why I say about, the Hebrew and the Greek brings out so much more of the meanings. And then Seir, who is the father of Timnah, who marries Eliphaz to produce the hybrid Amalekite. Seir goes back to another word that's Sair, or satyr as we were transliterated, that's rooted in Sair for satyr. So it's directly connected. And so Seir means, as the individual, part of that meaning is hairy, just as the Refaim and all of the giants were really, really hairy, whether or not it was blonde hair, red hair, or dark hair.
They're all Bigfoot. Well, it was a Horite. He was a Hurrian.
Yes.
Were the Hurrians all Sasquatches? We just
well, Sair, is that
there is the Kandahar giant?
Is that where we get the name of the region near Edom?
Yes,
where we find Petra and the Mount of Sair. Okay.
Yeah, it's the same word. Yeah.
Okay.
It's one reason Sharon and I think Petra is more theologically, spiritually significant than we've been taught. There's some good evidence to suggest that the original Mecca was at Petra, and
it was the capital city of the Anak too.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
Ah, okay.
In the book that's coming out now.
Look forward to that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Sneak peek. You guys heard it here first.
Because we plan to write a book. We think, and we're not prepared to defend this yet, so don't hold us to this, but we think that's where Sinai was located.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I mean, you imagine, the rock that's split, you got that one rock that's on top of Jebel al-Lawz down in Saudi Arabia. Imagine if you've seen the pictures of the Bab el-Sikh that you have to go through that 1.25 mile chasm to get to the treasury building, that you see in Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Just imagine Moses hitting that with the staff and this mountain splitting in half, because there's a wadi, which is like a seasonal river that flows out of it, that to this day, the local residents, in fact, the name of the village just outside Petra is called Wadi Musa, which means the river of Moses.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's right.
Okay.
So speaking of which, royal bloodlines, how do you guys think royal bloodlines, and we'll start with Gary on this, since this is something he does a lot of deep dives on, but I want to get both you guys in on this. How do you think royal bloodlines play into the events of 9/11, now that we discuss all of this awesome ancient esoteric history that has taken place in the Middle East, and 9/11 seems like a good excuse to get us back over there and get us involved in some stuff.
Yeah, so let's start with the word royal, which is royale. So that is king as in Roy, as in Rex, which is Derek was talking about, goes back to ancient Semitic words and other languages associated with king and ruler. As we talked about with Rez, it shows up as Rab, and this is Rapium and Refaim as the kings, and Al as it's spelled in English is just a transliteration of El for a god or an angel, and we see that in Baal, for example. So you could have it transliterated into another language, as I was talking about Babalu or ILU. Could be AL, could be ALLAH, which would be technically the feminine version of it, probably more referencing the power of that word than anything else in that sort of form. But there's different transliterations. So these are the kings of God, as in the bloodlines. These are Rex Deus, right? Kings of God, as they like to call themselves, and they take their genealogies back to the Refaim of Mount Hermon. At least the Western bloodlines do. And so they get their divine right to rule there. So again, if you're looking at how do the bloodlines affect 9/11, it's not something that you can sort of reach out and touch. It certainly isn't, let's say, the bloodline of the Windsors, for example, decided that they were going to hire some Saudi Arabians, and so it doesn't sort of work that sort of way. But it's the bloodlines that want to bring about this new world order, the Nephilim world order, and the old class systems that they used to have. They want to introduce the whole class system, and they need to bring down Western democracies, so that they can reinstitute their form of totalitarian rule, and they're going to want to get rid of things like communism down the road.
Once America falls, the rest of the West will fall as well.
So it takes time to put bloodlines in place. So Xi is a bloodline out of the Li family. Li Niji, he's part of the Western bloodlines of the dragon creator gods in China. Mm-hmm. And the original race is from the Xia dynasty, XIA, which Xi is short form of Xia. So he's part of the Western bloodline of and all of the dynasties of China were all of that Li and Xia bloodline. So you need to have anarchy. You need to have things that are going to raise up the bloodlines back into power, to have these kings in charge of the world empire in the end time. I'm not so dogmatic that I think that all of them will have to be bloodlines, but they're going to try, just like Putin will take his bloodline back to the Putyanin and the Scythian czars out of the Ukraine, which is why Kiev is so important to him. And his name comes out of nowhere in 1850, because his grandfather's in Kiev, and he's the offspring of out of marriage royal family of the Putyanin, and then they moved to St. Petersburg, is how he ends up there. So he wants to reinstate that old Kievan, Scythian, Tartarian empire. So these bloodlines are important. They may not all be 100% pure, and the Yamamoto bloodline, for example, comes from the Chinese bloodline. And then you've got bloodlines all over the world, like the Inga Roka, which were the Inca bloodlines, and they're still around, and expect these bloodlines to come forward. They all haven't yet, because they're struggling to bring this about. But if you want to get rid of the old order, you have to do a lot of things, and not the old ancient order, but the old order of the last couple of 100 years, where they're struggling to figure out, how do we get things in place to be in a position to go to the end game. And that's why the U.S. was so important. They've been the platform and the model for the world government, a powerful central government with independent states, right from the beginning, that was used as the lapdog to try and bring this whole vision of the Templars about. So it goes back thousands of years because they're just carrying on the same endgame platform, and the Templars are all bloodline families. So again, what I can't do is I can't point to a direct this to that bloodline. And the Saudis, I mean, they're a more recent bloodline. I don't know whether their bloodlines go back into ancient times or not, but typically those bloodlines do. So there may be some implication with that. We don't have a bloodline that's on the throne of Iran right now, and we don't have a bloodline that's on the throne of India right now. So this is a Western bloodline thing that's being mostly orchestrated. So understand there's bloodlines around the world that are going to have to come into play, but this is a Western funded and orchestrated thing through all the leverages of the secret societies, the banks, all the different organizations. And the Wahhabi, who were used in the Afghanistan war, are basically, you know, the beginnings of Al-Qaeda. So they were funded originally by the Nazis in World War II. And then they're taken over by CIA and American funding thereafter. And then they're hired as mercenaries for Afghanistan, and they kind of go rogue. So they've been sort of funding them, but I don't think that, and again, my speculation, I don't think that the American government was upset that the attack was done. I think they were part of in the know about what was going to happen, and it's part of creating windows of opportunity to leverage the greater plan across borders around the world. And we saw an avalanche of trying to change the Middle East, that reached as far as Afghanistan, that failed miserably, and is still playing out. So
as it always does.
I would look at it as a European-dominated plan, and it's the Europeans that everybody really hates down deep because they have a set organizational structure that they want, and they want to dominate this new world order with their bloodlines. Yeah. Well, other bloodlines like Putin and Xi, and we'll see other ones around the world, they're saying, no. We want a larger role in this new world order, just as Trump was trying to do. He wasn't against the new world order. He just wanted a larger role for the U.S., which the Europeans want to diminish the American role and sort of bring it back down to a less powerful, subservient sort of lapdog that they can utilize when they want.
Yeah.
Sharon has written, I've not really researched this, so this is really out of my depth. Sharon has written some of this into her Red Wing saga, and if I could throw in a plug, novel is coming out this coming week, The Poisoned Pawn, book 8 of the Red Wing saga. But it's not a coincidence that the protagonist family in the series is named Sinclair. So
there you go.
I love it. Sinclair's. Gary. But I will say this, as we look at all of this, and it's easy to get really angry at these humans that have this hubris that think that they can rule over God's creation. And just remember Psalm 2, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. You can just see Klaus Schwab, doing this and saying that they're German control casting for a Bond villain. But he who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. The thing to remember as we identify these guys and use discernment to figure out who is acting as the dupes for the principalities and powers operating beyond our sight. But these are idiots who think they're winning. I mean, it's pathetic when you think about it. They think they're in control.
Yeah, it's a pawn wearing a paper crown.
Exactly.
And they believe they can win.
He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision.
Yeah.
And a day is coming where they'll be on their knees in front of his throne saying, we were misinformed. I'm sorry, but that's not going to be a valid excuse on that day. And I use that phrase specifically. That's a reference to the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord.
The day of the Lord.
So we just need to remember, whenever we start getting caught up in this and our adrenaline level starts to rise, we start hyperventilating. It's like, huh, huh, huh. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Hey, you're on the side of the one who's got all of this under control.
Yeah. Yeah. They have a time where they can do this for. It's allotted, it's ordained.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a time when it comes to an end, and they're not in control when that end comes. And it's the restrainer that prevents not the empires from coming, from the Antichrist from coming to power. And so they are hubris, and they are being lied to, but they do believe they can win, and they're going to bring the world to that ultimate destruction level that Jesus has to step in. But there is a passage that I always like to make people aware of, other than the branch of the terrible ones, which I think is a good one. And also understand that, in the end time, as in Isaiah 29 talks about, is a terrible one, Antichrist, is going to be brought to an end. And I think he may have some bloodlines of the giants, just by, and I make that case throughout my first book, and I do again in the second book, but that's one of the terrible ones. That's one of the Amorites. But the verse I wanted to reference is Psalm 21:9 through 11. And it's very interesting for people who say bloodlines is not biblical. They'll only don't talk about endless genealogies. I agree. But they're telling us, the Bible is telling us about the people who do keep the endless genealogies, right?
Yeah.
But this is the passage that I would like people to consider about bloodlines in the end time. Thou shalt make them as a fiery oven in the time of anger. So this is the end time. The Lord shall swallow them up in his wrath, and fire shall devour them. And here's the money part of it. Verse 10. The fruit thou shalt destroy from the earth, and their seed from among the children of men. There's a separate seed, and a separate fruit and bloodline that he is going to destroy in the time of his wrath from the children of men. And for the intended evil against thee, they imagine mischievous device in which they are not able to perform. And we get another indication of these bloodlines in the end time in Daniel 2:42 in the Metallic Dynasty prophecy, where it's talking about the descendants of these beast kingdoms, metallic kingdoms in that prophecy, but beast kingdoms nonetheless, and that they are going to mix their seed with the humankind seed, with the seed of humans in the end time. It's talking about two distinct races of people that is still here and that are still controlling things, and these are the royals.
Oh, okay.
You just blew my mind.
Wow.
I never caught that.
Yeah.
I never caught that.
One can look at that as it's called, and there's also mingling and commingling in there. And when you get into that, you could also look at it, not are they going to reproduce, but it could also mean spiritually, as in a demonic possession, that they may be, some of the Refaim spirits or the Nephilim spirits might be possessing them. You could interpret it that way. I'm open to that, but I think the language is more clear with just mixing their physical seed with humankind. So it's kind of one of those passages that doesn't come through in some of the other translations. And understand, in my first book, I used the NIV version because I wanted to reach people in outside the faith, and I wanted it in a language that they were going to be more comfortable with. So, but it doesn't come through in some of those translations as well in that way. It's a different translation. So you get kind of a direction, but you don't get that sort of specificity. And so it's this seed of these children of the beast kingdoms, and the beast kingdoms are all made up of the descendants of the Refaim and these bloodlines. And you get some of those dynasties, like the Agag dynasty, you know, the Amalekites that now show up, and it's another patronymic name. It's like a Caesar. It shows up in the time of King Saul. And then you have the Agagites that are still around, which is a synonymous term for Amalekites that are trying to destroy Judah from the face of the earth in the time of the exile. You get many, and Hammurabi was one of those Caesar-like titles or Pharaoh-like titles, and that was a common trait of the giants, and we see that to this day. We see that with names of kings, where you have Charles III, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of that ancient tradition, just as the hereditary right to rule and passage that we're witnessing today is ancient. It is the same ancient rule of passing on power that they received as the offspring, the spurious offspring of the gods since the flood from, I think, the Baalim gods, and I think it's the same pantheon all around the world, so let's just call it the same gods, that gets passed on through that bloodline because they are their representatives on earth. They are the visible ones versus the invisible ones.
But Isaiah prophesies their death in Isaiah 26. O Lord our God, other lords, other Adonim have ruled over us, or other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone we bring to remembrance. They are dead, they will not live. They are shades, they are Refaim, they will not arise. Yeah. To that end, you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. And then you go down to verse 19 of Isaiah 26, and he talks about resurrection. Your dead shall live. These are the faithful. Their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. Your dew is a dew of light, and the earth shall give birth to the dead. Now, this is a difficult translation. The ESV, most of the English translations based on the Masoretic don't really get it. You go to the Septuagint in verse 19. The dead will rise, and those in the tombs will be raised. Again, Isaiah prophesying resurrection. Okay, this is not a New Testament concept. This goes back to Job, in fact. Those in the tombs will be raised, and those in the earth will be cheerful. For the dew from you, God, is a remedy for them, but the land of the impious will fall. Who are the impious? Read a couple of papers by scholars who've examined this and looked at it in light of Second Temple Judaic literature. This is a reference to the Titans and Tartarus, the land of the Titans. So in other words, in Isaiah 26, he prophesies the death of the Rephaim, the spirits produced by, on the death of the giants in Noah's flood, and their parents, the Titans, the Watchers, the sons of God from Genesis 6.
Yeah.
So again, for all of their manipulation and all of their political machinations, trying to manipulate bloodlines for one thing or another, Isaiah, 2,700 years ago, they are dead, they will not live, they are Rephaim, they will not arise. I think this points to who gets raised up in the last day. In 1 Corinthians 15, when there's that shout in the twinkle of an eye, we shall not all sleep, we shall all be changed. Oh, except for you, you're still dead.
Yeah, it speaks to your guys' mentat-like qualities, by the way, to go ahead and actually touch on that subject, because one of the questions from J. Reese Bradley, who is our first Patreon member, Honorary Gosling, was she was asking, are the royal bloodlines going to be, what was it, physical only, or are they going to have like a spiritual resurrection as well? And we didn't even touch on it. It's just right here in the chat, and you guys nailed it, just naturally rolling through, so it makes this so cool. This is like the Fellowship of the Ring that's cool,
Well, just remember that these spirits in the abyss, there's more than just the angels. There's the terrible ones. There are Nephilim that are there as well. And in Ezekiel 32, you have Pharaoh speaking with these terrible ones, the ones who were slain for doing, who did terrible things and were slain while they're on the earth. They're the ones that are in the abyss. These are the worst ones, right? And so they're not ones wandering the earth, but they're not in hate.
How bad that must they be to be the worst? Imagine what they've done.
these are the ones in the abyss, but they're still able to, at least in this vision, that they are able to communicate with Pharaoh. And what's interesting about that, they're on the sides of the abyss, the cells along the side, as it's described. These are coming out when the abyss is open.
Yeah, Revelation 9, verse 11. 9:11. How about that?
Yeah,
there
you go. And the question is then how are they going to interact in the physical world? Are they just going to be like the other demons that are going to have to possess, or will they have a dwelling place for that spirit being created, the Oikotarian, the habitation that is defined in Greek as a dwelling place for the spirit? Clone humans, some sort of technological things, whatever. If they're going to be out in the last 7 years and they want to interact, they're going to need a body. That's the only way they can really physically, truly interact. So
John describes them as having bodies. These are the locust-like things that come out of the abyss that some prophecy teachers have defined as attack helicopters.
In the 90s.
Yeah, these are the spirits that are coming out of the abyss. These will be fallen angels that I think can have physical form and take physical form, because they'll be able to torment people. And ironically, those like, who's this guy, Huvari, who was consulting with Klaus Schwab on something called Project Gilgamesh, by the way, the search for reality. They will get 5 months. And I think this is another clue that what we're dealing with here are the spirits of those, or those who created the spirits, and perhaps the spirits themselves who were destroyed in the flood, because we read in Genesis 7 and 8 that Noah's ark was on the water for 150 days. Which on a lunar calendar of 30 days each is 5 months exactly. So at the end, they get out and they get 5 months to torment humanity.
There's at least two things that are coming out of the abyss. You have angels, which I agree that would be, I think what we're seeing are another form of degraded fallen angels of a very high level. And we also get in Sumerian history descriptions of the same type of creatures, and it's also in the epic of Gilgamesh. They're called the Krabba-Balu and the Gerda-Balu, and the scorpion.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and they're essentially, I think, almost word for word the same type of description as what we get coming out. And then you have whatever these demons are going to be doing that are released from the sides of the abyss. When I look at the 200 million man army, that seems to be a direct connection to the release of the abyss. Their description is a little bit different. They're more akin to what's being described in Joel 1 and 2.
Right.
And these almost are like chimera type of beings or creatures, right?
When you get back to the chimera, and you see that a lot of these supernatural entities, like the scorpion men or the bison men or the mermen, were described in exactly that way, is what the scholars would call theriomorphic. They're part animal, part human.
Yeah, so I wonder whether or not that might be the Oikotarian for the dwelling place for the demon spirits to participate in the wars. We also have, the demon spirits coming out of the mouth of Antichrist, out of the mouth of false prophet, and the mouth of the dragon Satan, to gather everybody for Armageddon. That may not be one spirit out of each. And when you take that back to the Greek, it can mean mouth, or it can mean spoken of the mouth, coming out of the mouth. They could be ordering all of these demons to do wonders and miracles for all of the kings of the earth to gather them. So there's a whole bunch of things. Why is it important to understand prehistory? Because it helps you understand end-time prophecy.
Absolutely. Yep. And let me throw something out here, because I stumbled on this, and I can't be the first person to have noticed this, but this just kind of blew my mind when I came across this the other day. I was looking at the etymology of the word dragon. Comes from the Greek drakon, which means from Berkamite, to see, or one who stares.
One who watches.
One who watches.
One who watches. Yeah.
I mean, drakata is the Greek word.
Yeah. I mean, why have I never heard that before?
Yeah, I've never heard that.
Talked about that. Yeah.
It's in my first book.
Gary Wayne. Gary Wayne's who's talked about it.
I didn't
You guys
imagine
are
that's
getting all
just
kinds of nuts here.
No, props to you, brother.
Man.
Well, you know, it's
And
interesting.
the Urshu and the nether gods in Egypt, that translates as watcher.
Yes, the ones who guard the doors that you have to pass through to get to the netherworld. Yeah.
Oh, right.
The primary gods, though.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting that you guys bring up the host aspect for, you know, these terrible ones that are in the abyss and how they will probably need some sort of a human body. Because again, maybe that ties back to that Gilgamesh, not just the Gilgamesh project, but the invasion of the sarcophagus or the tomb of Gilgamesh that supposedly happened. Like maybe that's what they were aiming for, is to get to the sarcophagus, which may have been like something out of I keep thinking of the movie Stargate, where they're in like the healing chamber. Of course, nowadays it's like the biomeds, that you can crawl into and get healed. Maybe they were there to pull that DNA out so that they could utilize it to create some sort of a bioengineered host for the end. Stick around for the end times, baby. It's gonna be pretty wild.
I have go ahead.
The German team that was using and I can't forget, I don't remember the term, but they were using like a ground penetrating radar or something to survey the ancient city of Uruk. And this was going on in 2003, just prior to the U.S. invasion in March of 2003. And at the time when that story came out, I saw it and I read it as, they found the tomb of Gilgamesh. Later I went back and I reread the article and I found that the archaeologist who wrote the paper said, no, what they found was the former course of the Euphrates River. They found a building, the outlines of a building. They didn't actually excavate anything. They were using like ground penetrating radar or something. Yeah. And they found the outlines of what appeared to be a building just like the one described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So they didn't actually excavate anything. They found something that thought they kind of matched the description, but they didn't dig anything up.
So maybe they could replicate it if they needed to?
Well, I don't know. Yeah. But I know, because I was one who reported the story back in 2003. They found the tomb of Gilgamesh. No, they didn't. Or at least if they did, they didn't say so. But of course, they had to break off their work because we invaded. And so the archaeologists had to go home.
Interesting.
As far as I know, and that Freedom of Information Act request from the State Department a few years ago, somebody was looking for information on it, but there's no evidence that the State Department even acknowledged receipt of that request or responded to it in any way. So I don't know that there's ever been anything that was officially found or reported. Now, Tom Horn will tell the story of how he was sent photos by somebody who was apparently part of the team that went into the museum in Baghdad. Back in 2003. Yeah. But, and he talked about this on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. But unfortunately, back in 2000, before we moved out here, so this was after he moved to the Ozarks, they bought an old farmhouse about 5 minutes from where we live now, and it burned down. And it was a century home. The wood was dry as tinder, and it wasn't built modern fire code. So there's a spark from the electric box, and the house went up. And so did the computer that had the images on it that hadn't been backed up. Oh, no. So whatever it was that they were trying to get out, because apparently there were Marines there and there were some people from the museum, and they took something out, but can't prove it now because the photo's been lost, the computer's been lost, and whoever sent it to them didn't follow up and send another copy or couldn't or whatever. So we don't know. All we can do is speculate. But Sharon will say this, and she's got a degree in molecular biology and had an emphasis in genetics. DNA is a very fragile molecule. The whole Jurassic Park thing of extracting DNA from a mosquito 60 million years old, or 1,000 years ago, if you want to, because they found now soft tissue, including blood vessels in T-Rex leg bones. So unless we figured out how to freeze stuff and keep it fresh for 65 million years, it ain't that old. Yeah, but I digress. The DNA molecule is probably degraded to the point, even if they could identify, yes, we definitely know this body belonged to Gilgamesh or Nimrod or somebody, the DNA is more than likely worthless.
Yeah, it's junk. Yeah.
But since both of them lived prior to the invention of writing, how would we know? I mean, if we found the tomb, how would we, because there's not going to be a tombstone with Sumerian on it, because both of them existed prior to the invention of the Sumerian script, which didn't develop until the 3100 BC, which was the end of the Uruk period. So after that.
Gotcha.
We had a question about recommendation for the Septuagint. Was that right? I think it was just a couple.
Yeah,
of
somebody.
comments.
Yeah,
I think
someone
it was
was.
Jay actually.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I know we're getting close to time here for you guys, but if Nick can figure out how to operate that.
No, I can figure out how to operate it. I can't figure out how to make it go faster. That's the problem.
You can find Septuagints online, English language Septuagint, translated in the 19th century by, I think, L.H. Brenton, Lancelot Brenton, and that's a good translation. Faith Life, Logos, Bible software, Faith Life has produced a modern English translation of the Septuagint called the Lexham English Septuagint. It's not free, but you can get it for like $25.
Okay.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, and that was for Anne.
It was for Anne.
Anne Crichton, yeah, Anne Crichton.
She's one of our patron members also.
I think so.
We have like 5, and you would think I would know the names of them by now. But,
and they're all angels. They're all
classier people than I am.
I have one question. I know you guys are probably itching to go, but if you'll indulge one last question, and Derek, will start with you. Talk a little bit about the historical significance of the date 9/11, September 11th, before 2001.
Well, there's a book that is available online by Dr. Ernest L. Martin, and I probably wouldn't have looked at this, but our good friend Dr. Michael Heiser, who is a Bible scholar, has recommended it. It's called The Star of Bethlehem, the Star That Astonished the World. And you can find the text online. It's at his website, askelm.com. And I believe Dr. Martin has since passed on. But the book, in chapter 5 of that book, he goes into the historic and astronomical signs that identify the probable birth date of Jesus using the historical clues provided in the Gospel of Luke, the census of Quirinius and so forth. But the astronomical signs in Revelation 12, the woman clothed in the sun with the moon at her feet, when you combine that information, according to Dr. Martin, that points to one specific date. And again, God bless the inventors of the astronomy software where you can kind of pick a point on Earth and then rewind the clock, wind the clock back, and you get to September 11th of 3 BC as the most probable date of birth of Jesus, based on the historical evidence and the astronomical clues provided by John in Revelation 12. So you got that, but then you've got another date that is very significant to Muslims, because to them this was a humiliating defeat. A fellow whose work I know I've recommended to you fellows, and I highly recommend it to your viewers as well, Raymond Ibrahim, Ibrahim. He's his parents are Egyptian. He's raised a Coptic Christian here in the United States. He's an historian who specializes in Islamic history, and he's written a couple of books that I've read now. He's written more than just the last 2, but the last 2 are the ones that I've read, and they're just, especially if you appreciate history and how epic history can be. Sword and Scimitar, 14 centuries of Islam's war against the West, and the most recent book, which is Defenders of the West, which focuses on 8 well-known, or guys who should be well-known, who stood up against Islamic aggression into Europe, against Christendom. And on this date, 339 years ago, Vienna, Austria, was surrounded by an army from the Ottoman Empire. Now, for us Americans who tend not to know much about geography outside of our borders, this is significant because if Vienna had fallen, you had the German principalities to the north, you had Italy to the south, and both were wide open. Europe had been fighting with each other for about a century because of, God bless Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, but it divided Christendom at the worst possible time, because Vienna had been besieged in the late 16th century and again in 1683, where an Islamic warlord led the armies of Islam, Kara Mustafa. And for 60 days, Vienna was besieged and the walls had just about been undermined. It was about to crack when suddenly on September 11th of 1683, an army led by the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski, appeared, leading an army of about 74,000 troops. He was facing an army about twice the size, 143,000 Turks.
Wow.
Sobieski led a contingent of heavy cavalry called the Winged Hussars, so named because they were heavily armored. They carried lances that were a good 9 to 10 feet long. It's known from some of these charges that some of these Polish knights could skewer 2 and 3 guys in one charge.
Wow.
How strong do you have to be just to hold this lance that's like 9 or 10 feet long, and then much less carry another 300 pounds of human on the end of it?
Yeah. Kebab.
Anyway, Sobieski, who, based on the paintings I've seen of him, liked his beer, nevertheless could ride in the saddle 14, 16, 18 hours at a time, according to reports. And he led a charge of the Winged Hussars, who had these banners, almost feathered banners in the saddle that made it look like the wings of angels as they rode.
Wow.
And they came flying down a hill called the Kallenberg behind the Islamic army on September 11th of 1683, broke the siege, saved Vienna, and
Europe.
And so doing, he saved Europe. I mean, he was literally lauded by the Pope as the savior of Vienna and Western European civilization. Because again, if Vienna had fallen, the French had been conspiring and using the Ottomans because he didn't like the uppity Poles, and the Prussians were aligned with the French, and the Germans were Lutherans, and they didn't like any of the guys. So, it's like the Shias and the Sunnis. They hate each other more than they hate Christians and Jews.
Yeah.
But the same thing was going on in Europe. We had the Lutherans, the Protestants, and the Catholics hating each other. And finally, Sobieski managed to lead an army of Poles and Germans and Saxons and saved Vienna, and thus saved Western Europe.
Wow.
It's an amazing thing, and a curious bit of history. This, believe it or not, in commemoration of this event in 1683, is why we today have the croissant, because it symbolizes the crescent moon on the Ottoman flag.
Yeah.
Wow.
No kidding. So every time you eat a croissant.
Yeah. Crescent moon.
Land.
Yeah.
Crescent rolls are way better, by the way, especially the taco ring. Never mind. Yeah.
It's going to taste even sweeter now.
He's going to taste even sweeter.
Muslims remember this, and they still want revenge for this. We in the West, we forget history, we forget stuff that happened 10 years ago. Or in the case of Hillary Clinton, stuff that happened in like 2012. What difference does it make?
Right. Yeah, just go watch 13 Hours. And then I actually did some training with Tonto Pronto, man. And
man.
Yeah, you want to talk about like a really cool dude. Gary, I saw you throw a hand sign up. Do you got to go in a minute here? Are we running into OT for you?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Sorry about that. I thought my camera was low enough.
No, I'm glad I caught it, because the last thing I would want is to take you longer than you need to.
And Derek, you'll notice this time my camera did not die.
Oh yeah.
We found a solution. We found a solution. So thanks for bearing with us last time.
Gosh, once again, we got through literally half of our questions.
Yeah.
So you guys are awesome. And you guys are so much fun together.
I know.
It's so much fun just to sit here and just watch you two talk and just blow all of our minds. You would not believe the amount of like mind blown emoticons we've had in the chat.
Yeah.
Like the whole time. It's been awesome. So many people have been so super excited to have you two here.
Gary, I'm really looking forward to your book. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's specifically targeted at Christians this time.
Good.
And because people wanted to know more about what was in the Bible about giants and the angelic hierarchy, and how does that mix into end time prophecies. So it's loaded with information. I know I like it, so I just got to get it polished over the next month or so, and then get it off to the publishers. So
cool.
It's for people who really want to go deep and be armed with information that you'll be able to take on almost any naysayer with. It's just all there for them. So
I cannot wait. I cannot wait for that book to come out.
Okay. Final question for the evening. Pure yes or no, because everybody's got to go. So and we can always touch on it later, and we can expound on it more. And if you don't want to answer just a simple yes or no, then you can defer. Is September 11th Jesus' birthday?
More than likely.
Well, it's a good question. We don't know the exact date of Jesus' birthday. What we do know, it's not December 25, which is Mithra's birthday, and a few other people who probably had demonic spirits in them. So a whole different ballgame with that. So what we do know is that, from my perspective, is that, oh, I'm sorry, I won't take too long on this, is that it was the not in the raining season when Jesus was born. Otherwise, all of the sheep and all the cattle would have been in the stables, and they were empty, and Mary was able to get a manger. So likely that puts it in September to October. A lot of researchers say probably about 6 months after John the Baptist. So he was born in the spring. It lines up with that. But the exact date, nobody knows. What I will say about 911, look more towards, and I don't know the meaning of it, but look more towards Western bloodline occultism and sacred numbers and things like that. And the meaning's probably in there, and it's some sort of ritual sacrifice that has a special meaning to them.
Yeah, that's a whole interview in and of itself.
Oh, no, I know.
It's a huge topic.
Yeah,
huge topic.
Derek, real quick, yes or no?
I think the evidence, based on the evidence, I think September 11th is the best candidate.
Nice. Yeah. Awesome answers, gentlemen.
Cool.
Gary Wayne,
Guys,
Derek Gilbert. We have I'd love to get you guys back because we still want to talk about the Queen's death. We want to talk about I wanted to ask if she's back in Antarctica with the lizard people now. Where she belongs. No, I'm just kidding. I do, but I still I would love to talk to you guys about the Georgia Guidestones, and I'd like to get your opinion on Tartaria at some point. We could always do this. So we could absolutely have you guys back anytime you wanted to come back. This was probably the neutron bomb of Gosling's episodes.
This has been by far.
So this has been killer.
This has made my brain hurt more than any other episode.
Real quick, Gary Wayne, where can people find you?
Best place is my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on there's contact the author. You can also get a hold of me through Facebook. Best way on that is either on my timeline under Gary Wayne or through Messenger. It may take me 2 or 3 weeks to get back to you, but I will get back to you.
Awesome. And I think you have an Instagram also, but I don't know if you.
I do not.
You do not. Someone has an Instagram.
We need to unfriend that one.
People copy me all the time, and I do not have a YouTube channel.
Oh, okay. This is good information to know. I'm so glad. I'm sorry, but I'm also glad I brought this up. So, okay.
Someone is using your image and likeness.
Yeah, Genesis 6
Conspiracy. Yeah, I know. It's crazy.
Genesis6conspiracy.com is the best place to find Gary Wayne, or on Facebook. Derek, what about you, buddy? Where can people find you?
Gilberthouse.org. Gilberthouse.org is where Sharon and I put all of our stuff. We've got more websites than should be allowed, but it all links around Gilberthouse.org.
And you guys,
I almost had that nailed. I had your other website. Sorry, I would have had that up. Here we go.
Derek, you guys have an app on your phone now as well, right?
We do. It's iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire Phone, tablet. It can also we've also got a Roku app and an Apple TV app, and that gets our weekly programs. Sci Friday, Unraveling Revelation, my podcast, which just launched 8 minutes ago with Raymond Ibrahim, and also our weekly Bible study. That's all together under the app.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Yeah,
very.
I got it downloaded on my phone. It's rad. So,
that's awesome. I need to do something.
Okay. Guys, thank you again for being here. This was amazing. We'll chat probably just for a minute after the interview is over. We'll go ahead and let you guys go. Gary Wayne and Derek Gilbert, author extraordinaire, end times prophecy people, truly luminous minds and great friends of ours. We're incredibly humbled and honored that you gentlemen will be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Gary, an honor sharing the forum with you.
It's been good working with you.
I thought that was fascinating, guys. Okay, I'm off tomorrow. I'm seeing a doctor tomorrow to get a strip filled. So I'll see you in 48 hours, guys. God bless.